Marvel. Start with Betty Ross as my girlfriend. Chapter 81. Beep beep beep. Jane Foster pressed the horn hard, but the car in front was stopped and unmoving. In fact, it wasn't just the car in front, all the vehicles on the entire Manhattan Bridge were stuck and unable to move. There must have been a traffic accident somewhere ahead, completely blocking the entire Manhattan Bridge. It looked like this situation would last for a long time. The beep 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 sound was very annoying, so she couldn't help but press the horn again. Jane, stop pressing. It's no use. If we really can't go, then we won't, said Donald Blake, sitting in the passenger seat with a helpless look. To be honest, he didn't want to make this trip, but Jane Foster insisted on taking him to New Mexico to see her friends, saying that her friends could help him. After discussing all night, Donald Blake was persuaded. Actually, no matter what Jane Foster and Donald Blake think, Thor still exists in reality, residing within Donald Blake. It's not something that can be ignored or dismissed as if it will be fine in the future. This problem must be solved. After a night, the two of them had reached a consensus. As long as they could find a way to get rid of Thor, they would live a good life together from now on, and they would get married after the clinic was on the right track. However, despite saying this, both of them knew in their hearts what the final outcome of all this would be. It ultimately depended on the state of Thor within Donald Blake's body. Was he just like an evil spirit attached to Donald Blake's body, or was he Donald Blake? If it were the former, it would be better. Then they could try every possible way to expel Thor from Donald Blake's body. The most serious situation would be similar to the Hulk with Dr. Bruce Banner, but compared to the Hulk, Thor's situation is much better, at least he can communicate. But if it were the latter, if Donald Blake is Thor, it would mean that Thor would gradually replace Donald Blake, causing Donald Blake to completely disappear. In the end, only Thor would remain in this world, and Thor is to return to Asgard. This is completely different from the state of Dr. Bruce Banner and the Hulk. At most, the Hulk is just a beast with great power, without his own independent will. In this regard, Dr. Banner can suppress him for a long time, but Thor is different. Thor is a powerful god of the Norse divine race, incredibly strong in both power and mind, while Donald Blake is no different from an ant in front of him. The fact that Donald Blake said last night that he had lost his previous memories is enough to prove this point. It's not that if Donald Blake doesn't touch Thor's hammer, things won't get worse. That's impossible. To put it bluntly, with each passing day, Thor will become more mature and powerful, and Donald Blake will be in greater danger. Jane Foster cannot solve this matter on her own. She must seek help. She didn't call her mentor, Professor Eric Selvig, nor the mysterious Joe Young. Instead, she called Tony Stark, whom she believed was the most capable of solving this matter. Despite encountering many mysterious myths and legends, as a modern person, when facing a real problem, she still hopes to solve it using modern scientific methods. However, after communicating with Stark by phone, Stark told her that she should go to the base in New Mexico, as there was a solution there, and he could arrange for a SHIELD plane to pick them up and take them to New Mexico as soon as possible. This matter was quickly reported to SHIELD. However, unexpectedly, SHIELD rejected Stark's request. To be precise, it wasn't exactly a rejection. They just added a condition. If Donald Blake were to take a SHIELD plane, he himself must be in a state of complete control. What does that mean? It means that like Dr. Bruce Banner when flying, he must be completely controlled on the plane. Just as Dr. Bruce Banner can transform into the Hulk, no one knows when Donald Blake might transform into Thor. And if something goes wrong during the flight, it could potentially lead to the death of everyone on the plane. SHIELD's explanation was indeed reasonable, but Tony Stark always felt that there was something wrong. Logically, those people at SHIELD shouldn't be so timid. Stark eventually planned to use Stark Industries' private jet, but at this point, Jane Foster refused Stark's help. She decided to drive to New Mexico herself. Just as the people at SHIELD were worried that Donald Blake would transform into Thor during the flight, Jane Foster was also a little worried that the people at SHIELD would take action against them during the flight. It's not that Jane Foster realized there were Hydra members lurking within SHIELD, but she was worried that SHIELD would use some very special means to deal with them, just as they did with some other insurmountable enemies, and destroying a plane in midair was the simplest method. No one knew why Jane Foster would think this way, but early the next morning, she packed her things, got Donald Blake into the car, and prepared to drive across the entire America to the desert in New Mexico. However, this trip was not so smooth. They had just gotten onto the Manhattan Bridge when the entire bridge suddenly became blocked. All the vehicles were unable to move, and their ears were filled with angry curses and piercing car horns, as well as the pungent smell of car exhaust. And as time passed little by little, Jane Foster also started to become a little impatient. She now really regretted why she didn't accept Stark's help and insisted on doing this forcibly. Otherwise, perhaps they would have already arrived in New Mexico by now. Shut up. Jane Foster's face was contorted as she hit Donald Blake hard a couple of times, then she angrily said, "It's all your fault." Okay, it's my fault, it's all my fault. Although Donald Blake had a girlfriend like Jane Foster, in terms of emotional intelligence, he wasn't much better than those straight men, he simply didn't understand women's thoughts. However, he still cautiously said, "How about I drive, and you rest in the back for a while?" "No, I'm afraid you'll suddenly make the car fly." Jane Foster gave Donald Blake an annoyed look, then turned her head to look at the endless traffic in front of her. Suddenly, she violently slammed the steering wheel a few times, saying very angrily, "When is this going to end?" "This is the woman you found," a voice suddenly entered Donald Blake's ears. Just hearing this voice made Donald Blake's whole body break out in goosebumps. He looked unusually alertly in the direction of the voice and saw Loki standing in front of the car, dressed in expensive English attire, with a slicked-back hairstyle, holding a cane, looking like a gentleman, and smiling at him. That's right, at this moment, Loki suddenly appeared before Donald Blake. And in that instant, Donald Blake suddenly felt as if the entire world was just him and Loki. All the other vehicles, including the Manhattan Bridge, including Jane Foster sitting in the driver's seat, and even the Hudson River below, and the city of New York further away, all disappeared in that instant. The entire gray world was left with only him and Loki. Loki is indeed a powerful magician, and he is also a powerful wizard. Thor knows this best. "You finally found me, Loki. Tell me, how is Father doing now?" In the blink of an eye, the person who appeared before Loki had become Thor, or perhaps, it's possible that it had always been Thor appearing before Jane Foster. The two brothers meeting in this special environment, to be honest, it was already quite good that they didn't start fighting immediately. Although Thor had figured out everything that happened back then, what he lacked most now was a passage back to Asgard. And no matter how he wanted to return to Asgard, if Loki found out, he would likely use the Rainbow Bridge to destroy everything directly. The fundamental reason is that Thor cannot kill Loki, who has already taken control of the Rainbow Bridge. He can leave at any time. And for Loki, it's also very difficult to take direct action. Yes, he does have control over the use of the Rainbow Bridge. Although Heimdall is not obedient, he can also open the Rainbow Bridge at will with the Eternal Spear. However, he has never been a match for Thor, even now. Thor becoming close to being the God King of Asgard was not by chance. Over thousands of years, countless enemies have died at Thor's hands, under his Thor's hammer, and for most of that time, Loki stood beside Thor, so he understood the power of Thor's hammer better than anyone. He had originally thought that the Thor's hammer in New Mexico was the real Thor's hammer, but now it seemed that it was just a replica. No wonder he always felt that something was missing from that Thor's hammer during their battle. Perhaps what was missing was that bit of spirituality from the real Thor's hammer. In fact, if he hadn't sensed something was wrong, he might have really snatched that fake Thor's hammer and returned to Asgard. If that were the case, he probably would never have been able to find the real Thor again. And once Thor returned to Asgard, Loki's fragile rule in Asgard would collapse like a sandcastle. Odin was too cunning. To protect Thor, he even made a fake Thor's hammer as a decoy. Loki was almost fooled. But when facing Thor, Loki had already suppressed the anger in his heart. When he didn't have enough power to kill Thor, he would never act rashly, and he used the method he was best at. "Father is dead." Loki's face showed a painful and distressed expression, as if he was gritting his teeth and saying to the disbelieving Thor, "Exiling you, and the threat of war, he couldn't bear it anymore. You know, he's been like this for a long time. In recent decades, due to the loss of the cosmic seed, God King Odin has rapidly entered a period of decline, occasionally needing to enter the God King's sleep to recover. This is why Odin was in such a hurry to have Thor take over the throne." Regarding the true state of Odin's health, only a very small number of people in all of Asgard knew: Loki, Thor, Queen Frigga, and perhaps Heimdall. Therefore, everything Loki said just now could indeed break down a frail old man. "What? Thor was completely stunned this time. Tears had already flowed down his face without him realizing it, his face full of pain and self-reproach. It's not your fault. I know you love him. I wanted to tell him, but he wouldn't listen, and now, Loki sighed heavily, looking at his own reflection in the tears that kept dripping from Thor's face. He continued, the burden of the throne has now fallen upon me. As Loki expected, upon hearing his words, the sadness on Thor's face immediately stopped. He raised his head and looked at Loki with pleading eyes, asking, can I go home? Can I return to Asgard? Loki gently shook his head, then whispered apologetically, I didn't want it this way either, but the condition of the truce is that you can never return to Asgard. War. Asgard still faces war with the frost giants. Without God King Odin, Asgard's chances of winning are not as great as before. Once war breaks out, they will suffer heavy losses, so the best solution now is to sign a truce. Before Thor could finish speaking, Loki directly interrupted him and said somewhat painfully, also, Mother doesn't want you to go back. This is the final farewell, my brother, I'm sorry. So, farewell forever. Farewell forever, thank you for coming to see me. It's all my fault. Thor lowered his head in extreme pain. The car drove on the desolate desert highway, the sun high overhead, and the temperature outside was high, but the air conditioning in the car didn't make people feel much more comfortable. Donald Blake, half asleep in the back seat, lay there like a thoughtless corpse. Jane Foster, who was driving, glanced at Donald Blake through the rearview mirror. Since leaving New York, Donald Blake had been like this. She asked him what was wrong, but he didn't say a word, and throughout the entire journey, Donald Blake hadn't spoken more than 5 sentences. However, was Donald Blake, or accurately, Thor, truly struck by God King Odin's death? In fact, while there was a little of that, Thor couldn't say he absolutely didn't believe what Loki said, but he was at least full of suspicion. Loki was known as the god of lies and mischief in Asgard. Thor wasn't a brainless fool, so how could he not be wary of this? Furthermore, how significant was Odin's death? Without seeing Odin's body, how could Thor easily admit it? It's just that at this moment, he absolutely couldn't show too much enthusiasm. Perhaps Loki was sitting in the front passenger seat, monitoring him. Additionally, even if Odin might not have died, he was certainly dealt a significant blow, especially since many things were done intentionally by Loki, which made Odin's situation even more dangerous. However, Thor also couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief, because although the previous conversation with Loki was very bad, one point revealed in that conversation made Thor completely understand that despite the threat of war, Asgard was not in chaos because Queen Frigga was still there. Don't underestimate Frigga. Frigga is not only the nominal queen of the gods of Asgard, but all the goddesses and women of Alaska are under Frigga's command. Moreover, she also holds an Asgardian magic legion in her hands. Although such a magic legion has long been disbanded, they are real, and once this legion is reorganized, even Loki will find it difficult to resist. And not only that, the Aesir are not just the current subjects and gods of Asgard. Many of them live in other places. Some voluntarily choose to live in the Elven realm, while others, like Thor, were banished to other worlds. This includes his other brothers. Although it is very likely that Loki has now become the new god king of Alaska, his position is absolutely not that stable, and Loki has always been disliked by the Asgardians. Perhaps he can steal the position of God King of Asgard through despicable means, but if he wants to gain the recognition of the subjects and gods of Asgard, he must have the support of Queen Frigga. With Queen Frigga present, Asgard might have some problems, but it will absolutely not be in chaos, and this also gives Thor time to regroup and even return to Asgard. The problem now lies with Heimdall. If Heimdall doesn't respond to his request, he cannot return to Asgard via the Rainbow Bridge. He must find other ways, and the friends Jane Foster mentioned might be able to help him a little. Jane Foster has no memory of anything that happened on the Manhattan Bridge. She doesn't even know that Thor and Loki had a conversation, and that conversation was just a hair's breadth away from causing a war of the century. Furthermore, besides Thor and Loki, and countless people on the entire Manhattan Bridge, Iron Man, Stark and the people from S.H.I.E.L.D. were also monitoring. Although they didn't know about Thor and Loki's conversation, they had detected that a mysterious force appeared on the Manhattan Bridge at that time, and once a war broke out, it was very likely to cause the entire Manhattan Bridge to collapse. That's why they didn't act rashly. Although Donald Blake's mood was a bit dejected afterwards, he was generally fine. As for everything else, perhaps they can discuss it after they successfully reach the desert in New Mexico. And if Thor truly successfully reaches the desert in New Mexico, then perhaps it means Loki has left. And in fact, although the journey was indeed very boring, and the two of them even completely stopped talking later on, they ultimately successfully arrived at the town of Kassam. Yes, Jane Foster did not take Thor directly to the desert base. Instead, she first drove into the small town and entered their residence there. Anyway, after driving for a day and a night, both of them were very tired. Not only did they need to take good care of themselves, but they also needed to get a good night's sleep and fully recover their spirits before they could go to the desert base. Dawn, before we go to the base to see my friends, I think there are some things I must tell you in advance. Jane Foster placed the breakfast in front of Donald Blake and said with a serious expression, "The reason there is that desert base is because 2 weeks ago, something from outside the Earth fell into the desert 60 miles away, and that thing was eventually discovered to be a hammer that no one could move." A hammer. Donald Blake couldn't help but frown when he heard these two words, and then immediately asked, 2 weeks ago? Yes, exactly 2 weeks ago. It should have been the same day you had trouble in Norway. Jane Foster first drank a cup of hot coffee, then started eating breakfast, saying while eating, later, Eric compared it with literature and determined that the item should be Thor's hammer. No, Thor's hammer. Donald Blake was truly surprised at this moment. He had stopped using his spoon and couldn't believe what he was hearing. You know that Thor's hammer is in his hand right now, so how could there be another Thor's hammer here? What is going on? Jane Foster didn't notice Donald Blake's strangeness. She continued, "We weren't sure at first that the hammer was Thor's hammer, but then Loki came to snatch it, and he almost snatched Thor's hammer. He even lifted it, but later, one of our colleagues forced him to put down Thor's hammer, and after that, he also successfully picked up Thor's hammer, and used it completely, even more smoothly than Loki. Used it." Donald Blake simply couldn't believe what he was hearing. Not only did Loki successfully lift Thor's hammer, but there was also a third person who successfully became a user of Thor's hammer. What in the world is going on? I need to think about it. Donald Blake put down his spoon and looked at Jane Foster seriously, saying, "First of all, if I remember correctly, Thor should have a Thor's hammer in his hand, and that one is the real Thor's hammer. So then, the one here in the desert is definitely not the real Thor's hammer. No, it's definitely not the real Thor's hammer. Oh, I understand what's going on, that one is also Thor's hammer." Donald Blake seemed to understand something all of a sudden and couldn't help but laugh, saying to himself, "I didn't expect there to be such a person in Midgard." Jane Foster listened beside him, completely confused. What in the world is going on? It's not that complicated. When you get there, I'll explain it to you. Only then can you understand more intuitively. Donald Blake said with a smile, pointing to his head, "You know, I almost have all of Thor's memories now, but some things aren't that easy to explain clearly." Is that so? Jane Foster suddenly felt that Donald Blake in front of her was a bit off, but she couldn't pinpoint what it was. In fact, at this moment, any slightly smarter agent from S.H.I.E.L.D. could detect the loopholes in Donald Blake's words, but Jane Foster was different. At this moment, she was quite like someone caught in the situation. There was nothing she could do. Her feelings for Donald Blake were too deep. She even hoped that after resolving the matter with Thor, she could marry Donald Blake. However, she had no idea that her Donald Blake would never be able to return. Soon, the two of them packed everything up and drove straight to the desert base. And when they arrived at the desert base, Phil Coulson and Tony Stark were already waiting for them at the base entrance, except this time Stark wasn't wearing his Iron Man armor. After a brief exchange of greetings and introductions, Donald Blake followed Phil Coulson and Tony Stark into the base. They walked along a pre-planned route. After entering, Donald Blake immediately sensed something was wrong, and at this moment, he also noticed that Phil Coulson and Tony Stark seemed to be paying attention to their surroundings, rather than focusing on him. He understood. They were also worried, just like him, that Loki had quietly followed them in. However, he could guarantee that although Loki was very secretive in his actions, his patience wasn't that great. To be blunt, as Odin's adopted son, Loki also inherited some of his father's irritable temper, but he was better at suppressing this part of his temper. But on Earth right now, Loki didn't need to do that. and he was almost certainly back in Asgard, because Thor, without the Rainbow Bridge, had almost no way to return to Asgard in a short time and no longer posed a threat. Regardless of whether the person in front of him was Donald Blake or Thor, Phil Coulson took him very seriously, because he was not only a powerful god, but more importantly, behind him was a powerful divine kingdom. Evaluating the strength of this divine kingdom and determining their attitude towards Earth were Coulson's tasks. As for their internal war, although S.H.I.E.L.D. had no right to interfere, Loki's attack had forced them to take sides. They were almost at the only small building in the base. Coulson finally breathed a sigh of relief, then looked at Donald Blake and said, "Mr. Blake, this is our..." Before Coulson could finish speaking, the whistling sound of wind had already sounded behind his head. In the blink of an eye, Donald Blake's hand had reached behind Coulson's head, and the wind sound stopped abruptly. When Coulson turned his head, he saw that Donald Blake's hand was already holding a Thor's hammer, a fake Thor's hammer that had been left there before. "This thing is yours after all." A voice came from the small building. Everyone opened up, and Joe Young, wearing a U.S. Army uniform, walked out from inside. Joe Young reached out, and the fake Thor's hammer flew into his hand again, but after a violent shake, it flew back into Donald Blake's hand. Joe Young said with a cold face, "Can you tell me what's going on?" "Ha ha." Donald Blake suddenly laughed, and in the blink of an eye, he had transformed into Thor, covered in silver armor from head to toe, with a bright red cape, and the Thor's hammer swinging in his hand. Everything indicated that he was indeed Thor of Asgard. And as soon as Thor spoke, he immediately shocked everyone. "This one actually can't be called a fake Thor's hammer, it can only be called an unfinished version of Thor's hammer." Thor extended his left hand, and in the blink of an eye, another Thor's hammer appeared in his hand. Then he placed the two Thor's hammers side by side. Look closely, there are still some detailed differences between these two Thor's hammers, and only Mjolnir is the real Thor's hammer. This unfinished version of Thor's hammer, it has no soul in it. Thor waved his hand, and the unfinished version of Thor's hammer flew into Joe Yang's hand again. "Take it. From today onwards, this Thor's hammer belongs to you." In myths and legends, Thor's hammer was forged mainly from uru metal, incorporating the core of a dying star. Its handle is made from the wood of the World Tree, and Thor's hammer also has Odin's enchantment, making it impossible for anyone not deemed worthy by Thor's hammer to lift it. However, these are just myths and legends. How Thor's hammer was truly forged in ancient history has long been lost to the river of time. Today, Thor revealed a corner of the mystery. Back then, before forging Thor's hammer, several sample Thor's hammers had already been successfully forged primarily from uru metal. However, when attempting to integrate the dying star core, some sample Thor's hammers couldn't fuse the dying star core and ultimately exploded. As a result, after the final successful Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, was forged, there were still 3 sample Thor's hammers remaining. "Since this Thor's hammer has accepted you, it will belong to you forever from now on." Thor appeared unusually generous, which surprised everyone, especially Joe Young. He hadn't expected this at all. Earlier, when Thor entered the base, this unfinished Thor's hammer in his hand had already begun to stir, trembling non-stop, trying to break free from Joe Yang's control. Joe Young eventually let go, and it instantly fell directly into Thor's hand. However, now Thor said he wanted to give this unfinished Thor's hammer to him. This sudden change caught Joe Young completely off guard. He had already prepared to lose it. No, to be precise, he had never thought he could possess it. Although it is an unfinished Thor's hammer, its power is still undeniable. Uru metal is a powerful metal in the entire Marvel universe that is no less inferior to vibranium. In fact, due to its enchanting properties, it is even superior. Perhaps this unfinished Thor's hammer is not as powerful as Mjolnir, but it is definitely a top-tier divine artifact because even in Asgard, few people own a weapon made entirely of uru metal. At the very least, you would need to be at the level of the warriors 3 and Sif. "Belongs to me." Joe Young was truly a bit incredulous. Such a powerful divine artifact now belonged to him, forever belonged to him, but this is not entirely a good thing. If this Thor's hammer becomes Joe Yang's trump card, it means that he will be completely controlled by Asgard in the future. Not to mention the powerful god King Odin, even Thor could take away his Thor's hammer at any time, which means that if he ever stands against Thor in the future, he will have no power to resist. "Okay, thank you." Joe Young finally accepted this Thor's hammer with great struggle. He bowed respectfully to Thor to express his gratitude. Perhaps to others, Joe Yong was still under the strong impact of such a great piece of good fortune, but only he knew that the situation was not like that at all. Although this matter would bring him a lot of inconvenience, there were also considerable benefits. At the very least, once he obtains this Thor's hammer, Joe Yong will be able to stand firm in this world, and it can even be said that he will have his own place at the highest level, and no one will be able to do anything to him anymore. Moreover, even if his true identity is exposed in the future, as long as he insists that those things have nothing to do with him, then who can do anything to him? Because owning the powerful Thor's hammer makes him absolutely not to be trifled with, unless Thor is willing to take action and reclaim this Thor's hammer. However, would Thor take action against Joe Yong? No, Joe Yong himself has no other handle that people can grasp. And saying he is Werner Reinhardt, there are significant differences just from appearance and abilities. Moreover, in the final analysis, those are internal Earth conflicts and have nothing to do with Asgard. As long as Joe Yong stands on Asgard's side, Thor will never easily deal with him. And most importantly, Ragnarok is approaching for Asgard. Even if Thor wanted to deal with Joe Yong, he probably wouldn't have much time. Therefore, his superficial identity can be said to be completely established. All aspects will completely guarantee that this identity of his is not problematic. And to prevent his true identity from being exposed, Joe Yong had actually started preparing to create another identity long ago, and that identity would appear as Daniel Whitehall, and peeling back the surface layer of Daniel Whitehall would reveal Werner Reinhardt to everyone. And perhaps in the future, Werner Reinhardt will directly die at Joe Yang's hands, depending on how cleverly he arranges it. And once Werner Reinhardt is dead, then everything in the past will have nothing to do with Joe Yong. So, simply put, owning this Thor's hammer is equivalent to completely whitewashing Joe Yang's identity. As long as he doesn't foolishly admit in the future that he is Werner Reinhardt, no one will be able to do anything to him. Even if someone links him to Werner Reinhardt, a simple statement that it is false accusation will be enough for those who are willing to believe him to completely ignore those accusations. Of course, the premise for all of this is that he cannot be caught with any evidence of doing bad things, otherwise, a 1,000-mile embankment could be destroyed in an instant. In fact, Joe Yong has been implementing this plan all along. Otherwise, he wouldn't be an active major in the United States military today. And now with this Thor's hammer, his identity has become even more important to the authorities. In other words, as long as he holds this Thor's hammer, nothing from the past will be able to harm him. This is the greatest benefit of Thor's hammer to him, and this is why Joe Yong was willing to risk being easily dealt with by Thor in the future, just to obtain this Thor's hammer. As for the future, Joe Yong has now returned to the realm of legends, and the next step he wants to challenge is the realm of gods. He has already stepped onto the starting point of the path to godhood. Turning around, Joe Yong put away this unfinished Thor's hammer and followed the others into the small building. Sitting on either side of the conference table, Joe Yong looked at Thor opposite him and asked with a serious expression, "Can you tell us what the situation is now?" The situation now. Thor sighed helplessly, looking at Coulson, Stark, Eric Selvig, Daisy Louise, and especially the complex-looking Jane Foster. Thor finally looked at Joe Yong and said, "My brother Loki engineered my banishment from Asgard by my father King. I recently awakened, and Loki quickly came after me. He told me that my father King had passed away and that he is now the king of Asgard." Although everyone had already accepted that the person in front of them was Thor and that the one who had attacked a few days ago was Loki, hearing these words from Thor was still very shocking, especially the bloody turmoil contained in his simple sentences. Everyone present could feel a strong impact. Joe Yong already understood what Thor was saying because, no matter the dimension, Loki would ultimately contend with Thor for the God-King position of Asgard, and Loki was destined to lose. The root of all this was a scheme by Odin because he knew that Ragnarok was not far off. However, Joe Yong focused more on the two words Thor said, "awakened." What does awakened mean? Does it mean that Thor's consciousness had been sleeping inside Donald Blake for a long time? Does it mean that Odin had been planning all of this decades ago? Jane Foster also noticed these two words. She had already guessed a lot from Thor's actions before, but now with more confirmation, her heart ached immensely for a moment. "So what do you need us to do?" Coulson immediately followed up with a question. Thor's brief sentence just now had already clarified most of the situation. It was simply that Thor was banished to Earth, Loki came over restlessly, and even wanted to steal Thor's hammer. However, before Thor awoke, Loki might have been able to steal Thor's hammer, but unfortunately, he was tricked. His attention was focused on an unfinished Thor's hammer, which instead allowed Thor to fully awaken during this time. I need to return to Asgard, but Heimdall is not responding to my call. Thor turned to Jo Young and said, I need you to help me find a wizard who can send me back to Asgard. Wizard? Coulson raised his eyebrows, subconsciously saying, are there still wizards on Earth now? Cough. Stark on the side couldn't help but attract everyone's attention, and then forcefully suppressed his smile as he said, wizard is an old term. We now call them magicians more often. Magician. As soon as Coulson heard these 3 words, he immediately couldn't help but look at Jo Young. And Stark also said at the same time, that's right, magician. We have a magician right here. After speaking, he also looked at Jo Young with a half-smile. Seeing the expressions of Stark and Coulson, if the people present still didn't understand what was going on, they would be fools. The one Thor was looking for was Jo Young. In fact, Jo Young had indeed shown his extraordinary abilities in front of everyone before, but no one had thought of it from the perspective of a magician. This is actually not strange. In today's world, inhumans, mutants, cyborgs, and various superpowers are readily available. So, as long as Jo Young didn't explicitly say he was a magician, very few people would think in that direction. The reason Stark and Coulson knew Jo Young's background was that General Ross had reported it in detail to the White House. Although they did not have the authority to command Jo Young, it was not a problem to find out his detailed situation. You are a magician. Thor also looked at Jo Young with a disbelieving expression because he hadn't seen Jo Young as a magician from the moment they met until now. Actually, this is not strange. All of Jo Young's power is now covered by the power of Thor's hammer. It would be strange if Thor could see through his background. However, under everyone's expectant eyes, Jo Young actually shook his head directly and said, no, I am not a magician. I am a wizard who studies rune magic. You are a rune wizard. Thor stood up in shock. In fact, what he needed most at this moment was a rune wizard from the Norse magic system. Although there were magicians with various heritage on Earth, a rune wizard was the one who could help him the most. That's right, I started studying rune a long time ago. So far, I have mastered 24 rune, and as for more, there is no inheritance on Earth. Jo Young shook his head at Thor with a bitter smile and said, I'm sorry, I don't think I can be of much help here. It's okay, I have things you don't know. Thor said with difficulty suppressing his excitement, I can finally return to Asgard. Really? Then what should I do? Jo Young still frowned tightly. He didn't think he could be of much help in such a short time to get Thor back to Asgard. You know, learning rune is a very long process. From learning and mastering to using them completely, the time required, the materials required, including the steps required, are all very long and complex. It is basically impossible for Thor to return to Asgard with his help. The Rainbow Bridge is the passage connecting Asgard and the 9 realms. In Asgardian, it means the shaking path to heaven, Thor said, standing in front of a large electronic screen and pulling up all the data about the Rainbow Bridge on Earth. His gaze was fixed eagerly on Jo Young, intentionally or unintentionally ignoring everyone else present. But no one else said anything. They were currently immersed in the vast knowledge system that Thor was conveying. Especially for Professor Eric Selvig and Jane Foster, the 9 realms of the World Tree system completely overturned their previous understanding, while also verifying some of their earlier speculations and explorations. Coulson and Stark listened even more intently, as this had significant reference value for their exploration of extraterrestrial worlds. Normally, summoning the Rainbow Bridge requires Heimdall's consent. Without Heimdall's consent, generally, no one can summon the Rainbow Bridge. This was Thor's current situation. As the guardian god of Asgard, Heimdall possessed all rights to control the Rainbow Bridge, so if Heimdall did not respond to his summons, Thor could not return to Asgard via the Rainbow Bridge. So what about special circumstances? Coulson couldn't help but be the first to ask. It is the eternal spear Gingnir. It is my father's weapon, a symbol of the Asgardian god king. It has been imbued with magic by my father and possesses the right to summon the Rainbow Bridge, and this right is above Heimdall's. As soon as Thor said this, everyone immediately understood. In any kingdom, royal power is above all else. Although Heimdall is the guardian god of Asgard and is responsible for overseeing the Rainbow Bridge, God King Odin's authority is directly above his, and the eternal spear is the symbol of this. Unfortunately, the Eternal Spear is now in Loki's hands. Otherwise, I would have already made a move against him the last time we met, Thor said, shaking his head somewhat helplessly. Stark and Coulson, who knew the inside story, exchanged glances and simultaneously couldn't help but take a deep breath, secretly thinking how fortunate it was. If that battle on the Manhattan Bridge had erupted back then, the hundreds of people on and under the bridge would likely have been affected by the conflict, and if the bridge had been destroyed, the losses would have been over billions of dollars. In that case, things would have been truly terrible. My plan is to construct a rune magic array on Earth, then use the rune magic array to forcibly summon the Rainbow Bridge, and then take the Rainbow Bridge back to Asgard. Thor looked at Jo Young with piercing eyes, full of eagerness. Is that feasible? Stark looked at Jo Young, who was deep in thought. Could a passage to Asgard truly be opened on Earth? Theoretically, it is feasible. Jo Young glanced at Thor, then looked at Stark and the others, explaining, in the worldview of rune magic, everything in the universe is composed of rune. The Rainbow Bridge is naturally the same. If a correct rune magic array can be successfully constructed on Earth, remotely activating the Rainbow Bridge is theoretically possible. However, activating the Rainbow Bridge is only the first step, the subsequent teleportation is the problem. Isn't activating the Rainbow Bridge enough? What else is the problem? Coulson frowned, somewhat confused. On the other hand, Tony Stark, who was standing nearby, seemed to vaguely understand something. Activating the Rainbow Bridge is merely opening some kind of connection between 2 points in space-time. However, to directly connect these 2 points in space-time and perform personnel teleportation, the energy required is absolutely terrifying, to the point of being incalculable. Just thinking about the energy loss involved in directly opening a passage from Asgard, countless light years away, connecting to Earth, and then bringing people from Earth back to Asgard, was unimaginable. The main reason Asgard has been able to perform space-time teleportation repeatedly over the years is because Odin possesses a secret God King treasure vault, and within this God King treasure vault, he has stored various powerful treasures collected from all corners of the universe over countless years. This includes not only the ancient winter coffin but also the eternal fire. Even the cosmic cube was once in this treasure vault. It also contains countless powerful treasures little known to the world, such as Agamotto's orb, the Eye of the Sorcerer, life cards, and so on. And each time the Rainbow Bridge is activated, it draws energy from these countless powerful treasures in the treasure vault. Even so, the Rainbow Bridge cannot be activated at will, each activation consumes enormous energy. To prevent unexpected events that could make it impossible to activate the Rainbow Bridge in a very short time, Heimdall is stationed at the Rainbow Bridge Control Center. Thor is currently betting that although Heimdall is unwilling to open the Rainbow Bridge to bring him back, if he opens the Rainbow Bridge himself, Heimdall will not stop him. Of course, Thor will need to figure out a way to handle the energy consumption involved. Although Stark is not an expert in the field of space-time, he has some knowledge of these things. While he doesn't know the exact distance between Earth and Asgard in light years, at the very least, performing a similar type of teleportation would require several nuclear power plants operating at full capacity to provide sufficient energy. It might even require the entire Earth's energy supplied at once to successfully send Thor back to Asgard. This is a difficult problem to calculate, because even Thor himself cannot accurately say how far Asgard is from Earth. This matter is not that troublesome, Thor said, waving his hand to interrupt Jo Young and Stark's conversation, and then stated very directly, combining the power of 2 Thor's hammers is enough to activate the Rainbow Bridge and send me back to Asgard. Drawing free electricity from the atmosphere. Jo Young somewhat understood. Thor's hammer has never been a weapon that emits lightning. The reason it is called Thor's hammer is because it can absorb the free electronic energy between heaven and earth, gather it, and attack enemies in the form of lightning. Therefore, Thor's hammer can exert greater power during thunderstorms. And most importantly, the free electronic energy between heaven and earth across the entire earth, if it can be gathered, can reach twice the total capacity generated by all power plants worldwide, including all nuclear power plants. With such vast electricity, activating a Rainbow Bridge teleportation is naturally effortless. And all that is needed is for the 2 Thor's hammers of Jo Young and Thor to work together. From this perspective, one can also see the power of Jo Young's Thor's hammer. We can discuss that point later. What we need to do first is draw the rune magic array to activate the Rainbow Bridge, Jo Young said, looking at Thor with a serious expression. Even if I believe I am a genius, I don't think I can draw such a rune magic array in a short time. That's not difficult. Thor appeared unusually relaxed. He took out a piece of paper from his person and handed it to Jo-young, then said, "Over countless years, I have traveled through various places in the 9 realms on the Rainbow Bridge thousands of times. Therefore, intentionally or unintentionally, I have long memorized the rune magic array. All you need to do is reproduce it without any deviation." It was clear that Thor was well prepared, or to put it bluntly, Donald Blake was well prepared. These things were likely drawn when he was in New York, but Jane Foster, who was always by his side, knew nothing about it. Thor couldn't even attend to her feelings now. He turned to Coulson and said, "Moreover, our primary goal is not to draw such a rune magic array. What we need to do first is find a suitable location to draw the rune magic array. It's not just any place that is suitable for setting up a magic array, it requires a very precise location to successfully connect to the Rainbow Bridge. Opening the Rainbow Bridge passage to Asgard is far more complex than imagined." Although Thor appeared relaxed and seemed to have everything arranged, in reality, he himself was unsure of what the outcome would be. There is a reason why Thor's hammer fell in New Mexico. Although New Mexico is not the state with the highest average elevation each year, America's highest elevation city is located there. The state with the highest average elevation in America is Colorado, and Denver, Colorado, is the highest city in America, with an elevation of 1,609 meters, while Santa Fe, New Mexico, has an elevation of 2,135 meters. And coincidentally, their base is located closest to the city of Santa Fe. If I were to say all this was a coincidence, I doubt even a ghost would believe it. Although Thor is a god from Asgard in mythology, he has spent over 1,500 years learning various kinds of knowledge, to the extent that in some areas, his knowledge is more extensive than that of the most learned scientists on Earth. Of course, in many highly specialized fields, Thor might only know the what, but not the why, but this advantage alone is enough for him to provide significant guidance to the people he has briefly interacted with, and the biggest beneficiaries are undoubtedly Stark and Jo-young. Tony Stark is an expert among experts in the field of mechanical intelligence, while Jo-young has considerably deep research in human bioengineering. Putting everything else aside, the fact that he himself possesses such powerful strength now is enough for him to have a clearer understanding of the human body. Regarding Stark, Jo-young doesn't know the specifics of their conversation, but considering that Stark was later able to confront Thanos face to face, it is enough to show that he absorbed sufficient knowledge from the technological civilization of the Aesir. As for Jo-young, the ultimate goal of so-called biotechnology is still to make a person's body stronger, which for him only serves as icing on the cake. Thor's greatest help to him was guiding him on the path to becoming a god in the future. Upon reaching the legendary realm, the most important next step for every legendary mage is to become a god. Currently on Earth, it can be said that only 2 people have reached the level of a demigod, and these 2 are precisely Ancient One from Kamataj and legendary mage Merlin from Otherworld in the British Isles. Ancient One, with the help of the power of Dormammu, the Dark God, successfully broke through to the demigod realm, and if you add the Eye of Agamotto in her hand, even Thor and Loki may not be her match. Legendary mage Merlin from Otherworld in the British Isles is in an even more peculiar state. If he is within the Otherworld, Merlin can exert the power of a god, but outside the Otherworld, even within the British Isles, he can only exert the power of a demigod. However, once he leaves the British Isles, his power will plummet, at most only maintaining the legendary mage realm, and in some places even lower. The main reason for this is that Merlin has completely integrated himself with the Otherworld. Within the Otherworld, his power can be maximized, but outside the Otherworld, his strength suffers a cliff-like decline. Within the Otherworld, Merlin can be said to be entirely equivalent to a powerful god, but outside the Otherworld, his strength is difficult to exert. Therefore, even though Merlin's strength surpassed the legendary mage realm many years ago, he can at most be considered a demigod. And many people, including Ancient One, had actually reached the pinnacle of the legendary mage realm long ago, but most of them were unable to cross this step until death. Only Merlin and Ancient One relying on the Otherworld, and the other relying on the power of Dormammu and the Eye of Agamotto, barely managed to surpass this realm, but they are not truly considered to have reached the realm of a god, only a demigod. The term demigod was originally not a specific realm, it primarily referred to the offspring and descendants of gods, divine children who possessed the bloodline inheritance of gods, and were eventually called demigods. But now the demigod realm appears in the steps of a magician becoming a god, which only indicates that the magician's path to becoming a god has reached a halfway point and is stuck. This is a very special realm. The power they possess may not necessarily be weaker than that of a god, but in other areas, they are far inferior, such as lifespan. It is currently unknown how long legendary mage Merlin's lifespan is, but Ancient One's lifespan is likely running out. Furthermore, once they are in the demigod realm, it will be very difficult for them to take another step forward in the future, even for Ancient One who possesses the Infinity Stones. That is why, shortly after, for the sake of Strange, the sorcerer, Ancient One ultimately chose to commit suicide. Because she knew that once she lost the Eye of Agamotto, she would no longer be able to suppress the power of Dormammu within her body. The path to becoming a god for these two magicians holds great reference significance for Zhou Yang. For over 1,000 years, no one on Earth has become a god. At most, only Merlin and Ancient One have reached the demigod realm. As for other individuals who were equally powerful during their time, most have already died when their lifespan ran out, and perhaps some are still clinging to life, but they are no longer a concern. As for the profession of magician, Zhou Yang is the second person in so many years to step into the legendary mage realm and have the opportunity to challenge the path to becoming a god again. And the other person besides him is Dr. Doom. So even though Zhou Yang has now re-entered the legendary realm by relying on thunder god power, he must now prepare to assault the realm of a god. In a certain area deep in the desert, a huge circle with a diameter of 50 meters has been gradually outlined. There are only 3 people truly responsible for this matter. Thor is indispensable, and the others include Stark and Zhou Yang. Thor primarily serves as a guide, and Stark merely draws the general shape on the surface. The person truly responsible for every detail is Zhou Yang, while Thor stands beside him, explaining some key points on the path to becoming a god. The first thing you must do is leave Earth. If you continue to stay on Earth, you will never truly become a god. Thor looked at Zhou Yang and seriously warned him, "You should understand this, the obstacle here is something no one can break." I know. Zhou Yang understood the difficulty of the path to becoming a god. Otherwise, over the years, with so many brilliant and talented people on Earth, not one has become a god. Even Kamatage with the Infinity Stones is the same. This is enough to explain the reason. Why can't one become a god on Earth? Stark looked at Thor and Zhou Yang, somewhat puzzled. It's all because the magic element on Earth is too inert. As Zhou Yang said this, he extended his hand forward. The next moment, a small wind vortex appeared in his palm. If I were to say that using the same magic on other planets, this wind vortex should at least reach dozens of meters high, instead of having only this little power as it does now. That's why Earth is now called the Age of Magic Decline. It's not for nothing. That's right. If you can't leave Earth, you will never be able to experience a stronger realm. The magic element of Earth will firmly suppress you, preventing you from breaking through. Although Thor is not a professional magician, as a genuine god, his vision is something Zhou Yang cannot compare to. Secondly, what you need to do is fully comprehend the laws of a certain domain. I believe you should have already started doing this. Thor extended his hand, and suddenly, a huge bolt of lightning struck in the clear sky, stretching for several kilometers high in the air. It is evident that Thor unleashed this lightning not by relying on the power of Thor's hammer, but by directly using the power of the thunder god laws. Saying that he is merely the god of hammers and not the thunder god is a joke. Finally, and most importantly, you must obtain divine authority. Without divine authority, at most you will only be a pseudo-god. Thor followed up with another statement. For example, some people try to gather belief power to become a god, but frankly speaking, the gods achieved that way are merely pseudo-gods. Belief power is not even the power used by gods. If you don't master the correct method of using it, it can even lead to direct degradation. Even demons like Mephisto ultimately cannot directly absorb belief power and need to resort to various means to circumvent it. If others cannot find the correct way to use belief power, honestly, it's no different from seeking death. Then how is divine authority obtained? Stark, who was standing nearby, couldn't help but ask first, and in Zhou Yang's eyes, he had a bit of a curious baby vibe. Divine authority must naturally be bestowed by the God King. Thor's face instantly became extremely serious. Divine authority needs to be bestowed by the God King, and similarly, the God King can strip away divine authority at any time. This is not only reflected in Thor but also in Amora the Enchantress, and even in death god Hela. Why didn't Hela appear until Odin died? One must know that Odin was terribly old at that time, so the real reason is likely that her divine authority as the death god had already been stripped by Odin, and only after Odin's death could she reclaim her authority. Thor may be doing this unintentionally now, but he has clearly started cultivating his future helpers he can completely control. Is this a good thing? Of course, it is a good thing. However, even if Jo-young is to become a god, it will not be through Thor's hand, but by waiting for the interval after Odin's death and before Asgard is destroyed. Perhaps when I can reach that step in the future, I will be able to go to Asgard to meet God King Odin. A sincere smile appeared on Jo-young's face. As for Asgard's divine authority, even if Odin dies and Thor takes control, it probably won't be Jo-young's turn. The Warriors 3 and a host of old Asgardian warriors are still waiting ahead. How could it be his turn? There will definitely be such a day, Thor said resolutely. Perhaps even he didn't expect that in just a few years, God King Odin's lifespan would reach its end, Ragnarok would arrive, and even Asgard would be completely destroyed. Jo-young just smiled lightly and said nothing more, then lowered his head and focused on drawing the rune magic array in front of him. Constructing a rune magic array capable of summoning the Rainbow Bridge is not that simple. It requires Jo-young to meticulously engrave flawless runes in every inch of the 50-meter diameter area in front of him. Don't think that a 50-meter diameter is small. Each rune that Jo-young needs to engrave within the 50-meter space is only 1 millimeter in size. Think about it, accurately engraving each rune in such a large area without any errors, and ensuring that the stroke weight of each rune, the infusion of magic, and the connections between them are all perfectly precise without a single mistake. If Jo-young were given enough time to slowly work on it bit by bit, he would still be able to complete these tasks. But Thor was urging him tightly. He had to return to Asgard as soon as possible. Otherwise, if Loki firmly established himself as the God King of Alaska, what good would it do even if he went back? This is also why Tony Stark is here. He needs Jarvis to use the virtual imaging system to outline the completely correct rune magic array on the ground. What Jo-young needs to do is quickly connect it stroke by stroke while infusing his own magic, so that it can be successfully completed in the shortest possible time. It is also because he has now obtained an unformed Thor's hammer, and the power of the Thunder God has provided him with enough magic. Otherwise, even if he were exhausted to death, he would not be able to complete such a magic array. To successfully draw the rune magic array that can summon the Rainbow Bridge, the most important thing is that Jo-young must complete the most important spatial rune within it. In fact, there's nothing strange about it. The true core of the Rainbow Bridge is space power. Traveling from Asgard across countless light years to the 9 realms in a very short time, the most important thing here is, of course, space power. Only by penetrating space and breaking through the barriers of time and space can you disregard the time and space distance of countless light years in between. And this spatial rune is Jo-young's biggest gain from drawing this rune magic array. In fact, for some time now, Jo-young has been trying to create new magic elements through the special structure of the new element obtained from the Stark Expo. No, to be precise, it is to find the space magic element hidden in the magic world. However, even if he can find such a magic element and successfully master it, what he needs to do is create a new rune to accurately use this magic element, and only then can he open the door of space. But now, Thor has directly given him this magic rune of space power. To be honest, using the magic rune given by Thor to accurately draw the magic array is not particularly difficult, but wanting to accurately grasp the power of this core magic element through this magic rune is something that cannot be done in a short time. And although Thor knows this magic rune, if you want him to explain how to cultivate this magic rune, and the power of the magic element contained within this magic rune, it's not that he can't explain clearly, it's that he simply doesn't understand it. If it were a magic rune like lightning, Thor has cultivated it for thousands of years and is very clear about every key point within it, but regarding the spatial rune, it's already quite good that he can accurately depict it. Depicting is not the same as drawing. Truly drawing it still depends on Jo-young. However, it's not that Jo-young has talent in this area, but because he had previously studied a possible part of the magic structure of the acquired space magic element. He originally intended to deduce new magic elements through this part of the magic structure, and then depict the rune. But now, he has already mastered the rune. Now it's as if he already knows the start and end points of a line. However, inferring the process from these two aspects towards the center greatly saves him time in deduction. The key is that some choices and directions that could not be determined before can now be eliminated based on the final result, allowing Jo Young to ultimately construct new magic elements in a short time. No, to be precise, it is that he masters this power through magic elements. Moreover, unlike Stark's simulated cosmic cube particles, Asgard's spatial rune is a certain manifestation of the power of the universe's space. It points directly to the power of space deep within the universe. Not to mention the space stone, at the very least, its power is the same as that of the cosmic cube. In the rune magic array for summoning the rainbow bridge before him, most of it consists of the other 24 most basic runes. Only 2 others are involved. One is the lightning rune responsible for charging, and the other is the most core spatial rune. Time, it still needs time. Although Thor didn't realize how much help he provided to Jo Young, completing this rune magic array in a very short time requires a long time, and a lot of materials are needed for it. It's not enough to just draw the appearance of a magic array on the desert out of thin air. He needs some special magic materials to fix the magic array, otherwise, even if the magic array barely takes shape, it won't be able to withstand the massive energy impact. Of course, regarding these magic materials, Jo Young didn't even need to ask. Thor directly communicated with the people from S.H.I.E.L.D., and S.H.I.E.L.D. quickly found all the necessary materials. Even if Stark stepped forward, it would take a long time to gather these things, but for S.H.I.E.L.D., this massive organization spanning the globe, it only took less than a week. Night fell over the entire desert. At this time, Jo Young was not drawing the rune magic array below the desert. People always need rest, and no one's energy can be infinite, especially when long-term mental power and magic power output are required. It is even more necessary to ensure that when drawing the rune magic array, a person's spirit is in its peak state. And at this moment, Jo Young had actually appeared within the dark clouds above the desert. Although there is not much rainfall in the desert of New Mexico, it is not like the Sahara Desert where rain is not seen year-round. To the north of New Mexico is Colorado. A tributary of the Colorado River runs through the center of New Mexico, which is one source of water for New Mexico. Another source of water for New Mexico is the vast groundwater, the volume of which is so large that it has not yet been measured. Therefore, regardless, although New Mexico has some desert areas, it is not as severe as the desert in Nevada. Rainfall may not be frequent, but it is definitely not rare. The power of thunder is inherently very sensitive to the power of water. Only under the impact of positive and negative charges scattered among the dark clouds is thunder born. It can even manipulate the power of water through thunder, let alone Jo Young himself is extremely familiar with the power of water. Therefore, gathering countless water molecules above the desert, condensing them into a massive dark cloud, and then generating constantly surging thunder within the dark cloud is an extremely easy task for Jo Young, and this is under the premise that he is not using Thor's hammer. The power Jo Young condensed was not that strong, which is why everything seems so ordinary, but the more subtle and precise the control of these powers, the more it shows a person's skill, especially at this time, the more refined and detailed the manipulation of power, the better. The dark clouds directly concealed Jo Young's figure. However, deep within the dark clouds, Jo Young's hands simultaneously lifted slightly upwards, and in his palms, there were clusters of golden light flickering. If you look closely, you will vaguely see 2 extremely similar magic runes gradually taking shape. Although Jo Young now knows the appearance of the final magic rune, it is not that easy to clear this path. Ultimately, you must make choices in the details, and whether that part can ultimately take shape depends on what the truth is like. With a poof sound, the magic rune in Jo Young's left hand suddenly collapsed, followed by lightning flashing, and the palm of his left hand was charred by the electricity. At the same time, the magic rune in his right hand became increasingly clear. And at the moment this magic rune finally took shape, Jo Young's hands suddenly clasped together, and the magic rune instantly disappeared within Jo Young. And at this moment, Thor on the ground looked up with some surprise. In the previous instant, he vaguely felt a fluctuation of space power, but it disappeared in an instant. Could it be naturally generated space power? Although Thor had some suspicion in his heart, he was now more focused on the formation of the rune magic array, because so far, most of the runes have been drawn, and only the last 2 runes need to be integrated into it. Under the scorching sun, not even the smallest grain of sand in the desert wanted to move, but near the summoning rainbow bridge rune magic array under the sky, a circle of people stood. Thor, Iron Man Tony Stark, Professor Eric Selvig, Jane Foster, as well as Shield's Hawkeye and Phil Coulson. Standing in the center of the rune magic array was the fully prepared Jo Young. At this moment, he said to Thor with an extremely ugly expression, "Do we really have to do this, Thor? What if it fails? If it fails, it fails. At worst, we'll just start over." Although he was the most anxious one, Thor appeared indifferent to success or failure in front of everyone. However, he immediately explained the reason. If this time doesn't succeed, then there's no hope of success in the short term. That's enough time to redraw a magic array. But if this time succeeds, people always need to be pushed. This guy, he still wants to return to Asgard in the shortest possible time. He is the one who can't wait the most among everyone. Actually, before today, Jo Young had attempted to draw spatial runes countless times, but not a single one was successful. And in this, he held nothing back. Although he had gained a certain understanding of spatial power by reverse engineering the rune samples provided by Thor, he was unable to draw spatial runes using this bit of spatial power. However, in this situation, Thor still wanted Jo Young to try, even if it failed. Did it really not matter? In Jo Young's opinion, Thor was still gambling that Jo Young could successfully draw the magic array under immense pressure. Anyway, if it failed, it would be no different from continuing to wait. Jo Young lowered his head and looked at the rune magic array beneath his feet. Except for the spot where he stood, the entire rune magic array was filled with dense, almost invisible runes of various kinds, and all the runes were interconnected in a special way. To be honest, ensuring that every rune in such a large rune array was without problems was a significant test for Jo Young. He couldn't do such a thing even after his strength broke through to the legendary realm in Jotunheim, let alone after returning to Earth, where his strength was suppressed below the legendary realm by Earth's environment. Perhaps only now, after he had mastered Thunder God's power with the help of Thor and Stark, could he barely achieve this. For this final rune drawing today, Jo Young had rested for 3 consecutive days beforehand, the goal being to succeed in one go. However, the risks involved were also significant. If it succeeded, that would be one thing, but once it failed, not only would the magic array they had drawn before be completely destroyed, but Jo Young himself would also bear the full backlash. Fortunately, Jo Young now had this Thor's hammer of his own. Although this Thor's hammer was an unfinished version, even so, this Thor's hammer was a top-tier artifact. Although it couldn't compare to Thor's hammer, having it to ultimately bear the recoil when the magic array was destroyed would make Jo Young's situation much better. Perhaps he would still inevitably be severely injured. Nevertheless, even so, Jo Young had to give it a try under Thor's compulsion. Because from the depths of his heart, he also wanted to push himself. Perhaps he would really succeed. Time waits for no one. At this time, the longer Thor delayed returning to Asgard, the greater the changes that would occur in Asgard. If Loki accidentally discovered Odin's secret and then secretly attacked Odin to death, or if there were other changes that caused Odin to lose control of the situation, then no one would really know how the subsequent situation would unfold. Odin's strength is indeed the strongest in the 9 realms, but his current situation is hard to say. The only thing that is certain is that his strength is not at its peak state. If it were, then Odin would not have set up such a dangerous situation. The current world is already unrecognizable from what Jo Young originally knew. Although the general outline is still there, he must be very careful with every step. Once it is out of control, even he himself does not know what will happen. In this situation, even greater changes in Asgard are even less acceptable. Otherwise, if Thanos attacks tomorrow, who can withstand it? Therefore, Thor must be sent back to Asgard as quickly as possible. You all step back, otherwise if it fails later, not everyone will survive the huge explosion. After Jo Young finished speaking, regardless of Professor Eric Selvig, Jane Foster, and Shield's Hawkeye and Phil Coulson who were already tacitly retreating, his white-brown oak wand had already slipped out of his sleeve. Under the infusion of magic power, he began to draw the most complex and difficult to understand spatial runes under his feet, and also carefully connected them with other runes. The small circle with a diameter of 30 centimeters under Jo Young's feet was all for him to draw this spatial rune. Unlike the previous requirement that other runes must be drawn to 1 millimeter in size, Jo Young's spatial rune would be as large as possible. On the one hand, this was a requirement of the rune array itself. At least the rune array that Thor took out was like this. On the other hand, the larger the space, the more it could ensure that Zhou Yang would not make mistakes, but this did not alleviate his pressure in the slightest. A Thor's hammer flew out from behind Zhou Yang's head and flew directly above his head. Immediately after, Zhou Yang's feet touched the ground, and his entire body immediately flew backward upside down, with his feet firmly hooked onto the Thor's hammer that belonged to him. The ground under his feet could no longer accommodate his standing position. He had to do this to ensure the continued drawing of the rune array. At the same time, immense magic power also surged into Zhou Yang's body from this Thor's hammer, supplementing his own insufficient magic power. Thinking about it, Zhou Yang was already a powerful legendary magician, and he had rested for 3 days before this, with everything in his peak state. But even so, he needed to supplement his magic power through Thor's hammer. One can imagine how immense the magic power required to complete such a special magic array was. In Zhou Yang's own words, this was at least a god-level magic array, and the magic power required was at least at a god-level standard. Fortunately, his Thor's hammer was a sufficiently powerful artifact, otherwise, he would not be able to draw this magic array at all. And the most crucial thing was that this Thor's hammer now completely belonged to him. The thunder god's power on the Thor's hammer could be transmitted into his body without any loss and quickly converted into magic power in his body. Otherwise, Zhou Yang would not be able to last until the end. And the truly thrilling part had only just begun. Zhou Yang's initial drawing was quite smooth, but as the magic power in his body poured out like water, Zhou Yang did not dare to let his mental power be distracted in the slightest, because even a tiny mistake could lead to his utter destruction. Zhou Yang had never successfully completed the drawing of a spatial rune before. Although he had grasped a trace of spatial power, there was still a very long way to go before he could use it smoothly. But now, he was forced by Thor to continue. Although in a sense this was also his own request, he had to succeed as much as possible. Because even with Thor's hammer bearing the backlash of failure for him, if he could not transfer the backlash to Thor's hammer the moment it failed, then all the backlash would be borne by Zhou Yang himself. If that happened, he could very likely lose his life. In fact, at this time, it was not only the people present who were paying attention to Zhou Yang. The representatives of the SHIELD, World Security Council, as well as the American White House, were actively observing the development of the situation. In any case, behind Thor was a vast divine civilization. Once the rune magic array drawn by Zhou Yang succeeded, this divine civilization would immediately establish contact with Earth. Whether the two sides would engage in mutual warfare or friendly and harmonious contact was very uncertain. Even without mentioning the struggle between Thor and Loki, just from the perspective that Thor was an alien, they all had to be prepared for war with Asgard. After all, the last contact between Earth and an extraterrestrial civilization almost destroyed the entire Earth. Although it is not yet time to activate the magic array to summon the Rainbow Bridge, all parties are closely watching this point, and once the Rainbow Bridge is summoned, it is likely that all parties' super weapons will be ready in an instant. However, activating the summoning magic array is not something Thor can do just by saying so. He must negotiate a predetermined activation time with SHIELD and the American government, otherwise, not to mention Zhou Yang, Stark alone would immediately receive a call from the White House. This spatial rune in front of him was as large as possible, but that didn't mean it was easy to draw. This also required Zhou Yang to concentrate all his attention. Not even the slightest detail could be wrong, otherwise the consequences would be extremely serious. Others might not be able to feel this, but Thor knew in his heart that Zhou Yang was helping him with his life on the line. So at this moment, Thor had flown above the rune magic array. Although he didn't know much about spatial runes, he could still help Zhou Yang at a critical moment. The sky quickly darkened, but now everything was only halfway through. Thor was watching constantly, and his biggest opponent, Loki, was also watching. When you sit on the throne of the God King of Asgard, you can see everything in the 9 realms. Heimdall had long been relieved of the heavy responsibility of guarding the Celestial Palace. At this time, the external gate of Alaska had been completely closed. Except for Loki, no one could enter or leave Asgard. Loki found it hard to believe that an ordinary mortal, even though he was a legendary magician, was still a mortal. For a mortal to draw a rune magic array that could summon the Rainbow Bridge from scratch was simply a fantasy. Unfortunately, he did not know Zhou Yang's specific origin. If he had a full understanding of Zhou Yang like Heimdall, he would never have done this. However, this did not mean that Loki had no other thoughts. In fact, if Thor had not already flown above Jo Young and the magic array, Loki would probably have already recklessly moved to eliminate Jo Young. But even so, Loki began to prepare for the worst. The night passed quickly, and under the gaze of almost everyone, Jo Young finally drew the last stroke. In an instant, golden light surged in every corner of the entire rune magic array, emitting an unusual brilliance. It succeeded. The rune magic array that could summon the Rainbow Bridge succeeded. Even Jo Young himself hadn't expected this. However, although he was incredibly excited at this moment, he suddenly felt as if all the strength had left his body, and he was about to fall onto the rune magic array. At this moment, Thor manipulated Jo Young's Thor's hammer and carried him away from above the rune magic array. Meanwhile, in Asgard, in the Hall of the Divine King, before Loki, who was holding the Eternal Spear, Asgard's ultimate weapon, the Destroyer, slowly came online. Jo Young lay on the cold desert, his face full of a satisfied smile, which shone brightly in the morning sun. For him, completing such a rune magic array was a culmination of his entire magic career. Although it wouldn't cause his magic realm to advance by leaps and bounds, it allowed him to gain a deeper understanding of some mistakes he made during his magic cultivation process and some areas that could be improved. It wasn't just about a rapid increase in combat power after completion. Even now, compared to before, he was much harder to deal with. The most crucial thing was the completion of that spatial rune, which finally allowed Jo Young to grasp the power of space. Even if it was just a preliminary step into this domain, it was enough. The completion of this spatial rune meant far more to him than anything else. This meant that even if his true identity were revealed now, it would be difficult for even Thor himself to catch him if he were to pursue him. Of course, if it were the Ancient One or Loki, that would be another matter. Jo Young finally understood now why Loki had mysteriously disappeared at the end of their battle back then. There was only one real reason. At the final moment, Loki had instantly teleported away. As the strongest magician in Asgard besides Queen Frigga, how could Loki not understand the spatial rune that even Jo Young could master? Jo Young had to admit now that Loki was far more powerful and harder to deal with than the Loki he knew from the dimensional space. The gap between him and Loki was terrifyingly large. If the magic elements on Earth hadn't been incredibly inert, he would probably have been taken care of by Loki long ago. From this perspective, wasn't the increased inertness of magic elements on Earth a form of protection for Earth's humans? However, if Loki was already so powerful, then how incredibly powerful must Thor be, who had suppressed him for 1,000 years, leaving him breathless? Don't look at how Thor, now wielding Thor's hammer, has forced everyone to obey him. This is already after a portion of his divine power was stripped by Odin. Once that portion of divine power returns, Thor's strength will be even more terrifying. It was precisely because of this that Loki went to great lengths to prevent Thor from returning to Asgard. Just like now, Jo Young was still lying on the desert slowly recovering his strength, but at this moment, the Rainbow Bridge summoning rune magic array on the ground suddenly began to rotate rapidly, erupting with incredibly dazzling light. Not to mention that every office remotely monitoring this place suddenly became a scene of chaos. Even Stark, who was floating opposite Thor, immediately turned his vigilant gaze towards Thor. They had discussed it. To summon the Rainbow Bridge and activate the rune magic array, everyone had to agree on a unified time. But now, the Rainbow Bridge summoning rune magic array was rapidly activated shortly after this rune magic array was completed. No, I didn't do it. Thor's face was also full of shock. He glanced at the rune magic array on the ground, then at Stark, and finally his gaze fell on his Thor's hammer. His eyes lit up, and he quickly explained to Stark, I haven't injected energy into it yet. Hearing Thor's explanation, Stark immediately understood that this was indeed not done by Thor. Because when this rune magic array was completed, although Jo Young was only initially exposed to such a large rune magic array, and although this was a complete rune magic array taught by Thor, under Stark's strong request, no, to be precise, under the strong request of the Earth government, they still modified this rune magic array as much as possible. It was impossible to make changes in any decisive aspects, as that would affect the integrity of the entire rune magic array. So the only area where modifications could be made was in the runes for energy input, as this itself needed to be modified to accommodate the input of Thor's lightning power. In reality, this wasn't exactly a modification, because the energy source of the Rainbow Bridge itself was very complex. It came from the energy storage of countless powerful treasures in Odin's treasure vault. These powerful treasure artifacts themselves contained powerful laws, and even if their energies were reluctantly merged together, they actually went their separate ways. Therefore, the Rainbow Bridge ultimately didn't merge them together but used them equally, which is why the Rainbow Bridge is 7 colors. So, to be precise, this wasn't a modification, but just a partial adaptation, allowing this rune magic array to absorb the lightning power absorbed by Thor's hammer, while also being able to absorb the arc reactor that Stark modeled after the cosmic cube particle. Thor's eyes weren't blind, he could see that the energy essence of Stark's arc reactor was very high. Although he didn't know the specific source, having him participate was definitely a good thing. Stark's fundamental purpose in doing this was to gain a portion of control over this Rainbow Bridge summoning rune magic array, to avoid being caught off guard by Thor. And now, the unexpected situation still occurred. The sudden activation of the Rainbow Bridge summoning rune magic array caused Stark to immediately focus his suspicion on Thor. In that instant, he even suspected that Thor's compromise with him was actually a deception. However, after being reminded by Thor, Stark suddenly realized that not only had he not input energy into the summoning rune magic array before, but Thor hadn't either. This meant that this rune magic array had suddenly activated without any energy input. Jo-young, Stark instantly turned his head to look at Jo-young. Jo-young was the one who had truly drawn this rune magic array. If anyone could input enough energy into this rune magic array and quietly activate it without him and Thor noticing, it would definitely be him. But with one look, Stark immediately dismissed his own thought, because before his eyes, Jo-young was lying there completely without any strength. An entire day and night of effort. Jo-young had to output countless amounts of magic and mental energy every moment. To be able to forcefully support himself until now was already extremely difficult, let alone successfully completing the drawing of the rune magic array, which was a stroke of luck. Asgard has made a move. Thor's voice softly echoed in Stark's ear. Stark's eyes widened in fear, and then, like a madman, he told Jarvis to contact all parties to prepare for war. He had completely understood the outcome of this situation. Although they didn't want to get involved in Asgard's internal conflicts, by choosing to stand with Thor and helping him, they had effectively taken a side. Even with the power of the Rainbow Bridge to pierce through space and time, there is still a tiny bit of time loss when traveling from Asgard to Earth across countless light years, not to mention the time required to enter and exit the Rainbow Bridge. And it is this meager amount of time that Earth has to react. 7-colored rainbow light suddenly descended from the endless distance in the starry sky, and a sandstorm that reached the sky formed in an instant. Looking from afar, even the clouds high in the sky were scattered into pieces. The massive storm directly churned from the clouds down to the desert, and in an instant, everything became obscured. Within this rapidly rotating desert, a figure walked out from the 7-colored rainbow light. Even before seeing the specific appearance of the newcomer, a heavy pressure had already fallen upon everyone present. Especially Thor and Stark, they were the strongest and the most sensitive, and they were the first to sense the power of the approaching enemy. Almost in an instant, both of them were fully prepared for battle. Especially for Stark, he had to buy enough time for Earth's defense. However, just as the two of them were fully on guard and preparing to fight, a roar suddenly came from within the Rainbow Bridge. "Sif, Volstagg, how dare you!" Immediately after, several more figures burst out from the Rainbow Bridge, and then the rainbow light dissipated. As the rainbow light dissipated, the storm on the desert instantly lost its power and began to subside rapidly. And it was at this moment that heavy footsteps were heard. A silver giant, 3 meters tall, emerged step by step from the sandstorm, its entire body shimmering with a captivating metallic luster. Circle after circle of body patterns had countless magic runes secretly drawn within them. Its combat stance, which looked clumsy but was actually exceptionally agile, revealed incredibly powerful combat ability, but everyone's attention was focused on its furnace-like head. As its eyes flickered, a golden glow permeated out, and even from a distance of tens of meters, one could feel the destructive intent contained within it. In the sandstorm, Thor slowly descended from high in the sky and then stood opposite the silver giant. At the same time, 4 other figures, looking slightly disheveled, surrounded the silver giant. These 4 figures were none other than Sif and the Warriors 3. They were the reason for Loki's immense anger. In reality, while Loki had been keeping an eye on Thor, there were also people keeping an eye on him. Although Sif and the Warriors 3 had no way to go to Earth to find Thor, and even more so, After Loki took over all the power of Asgard, they were all confined to their homes. But this didn't mean they had no way. Just as Sif, Fandral, and Hogun were racking their brains, Volstagg, who had drunk too much, inadvertently said, "Actually, we don't need to bother searching. Loki will always go after Thor. We just need to keep a close eye on him, and we will eventually find Thor. It's just that we need to move faster." Although Volstagg was always drunk, his experience was indeed the richest among everyone. In their small group, Volstagg was the oldest. In a sense, it was Odin who had him guide these young people from a young age and help them grow. And how could a person entrusted with such a heavy responsibility by Odin be a simple figure? It was precisely because of this that when Loki activated the Rainbow Bridge to send the destroyer to Earth, the three of them directly broke out from the Rainbow Bridge Control Center, rushed into the Rainbow Bridge in the shortest possible time, and followed it to Earth. As expected, as soon as they landed, they saw Thor flying in midair, as well as the incredibly tall destroyer armor. There was no time for pleasantries at this moment. Thor had already started shouting loudly, "Everyone be careful, this is Asgard's destroyer armor. It possesses energy that can destroy the heavens and earth. Everyone, get as far away from here as possible. Once the battle begins." Thor didn't need to say more. Before his words had even finished, a blinding beam of destruction had already directly vaporized all the air in between, and it brutally and unreasonably blasted towards Thor. Accompanied by incredibly scorching energy, an energy beam with a diameter exceeding half a meter directly struck Thor. No, to be precise, it struck Thor's hammer in front of Thor. If purely comparing speed, Thor's hammer was not slow at all compared to the destroyer's energy beam, and it completely blocked the destroyer's attack. However, the destroyer did not persist in confronting Thor's hammer. In an instant, the destroyer's energy beam had already swept to the side. The ground instantly exploded, and as countless sand and stones flew, they were completely turned into glass in a very short time. The immense energy contained within it made people gasp in amazement. And even more crucially, the sweeping energy beam directly struck the rune-summoning rune magic array on the side, instantly tearing the rune-summoning rune magic array that Zhou Yang and the others had painstakingly constructed into pieces. And not only that, as the powerful energy beam swept across the rune-summoning rune magic array, Zhou Yang, who was resting on the other side, couldn't react at all. In an instant, he was directly torn into pieces by the destroyer's energy beam. What kind of energy beam was that? That was simply the most terrifying beam of destruction. Chapter 91. Loki. Thor couldn't help but roar, the Thor's hammer in his hand smashing fiercely towards the destroyer. By this time, it was already crystal clear what Loki wanted to do. Now on Earth, only Zhou Yang could draw the rune magic array to summon the Rainbow Bridge, and as soon as Zhou Yang died, no one would be able to draw this magic array again. Coupled with Loki controlling the Rainbow Bridge, as long as he didn't open the Rainbow Bridge to bring Thor back, Thor would only be able to stay on Earth forever, never thinking of returning to Asgard. Thor's hammer smashed heavily onto the destroyer armor's arm, but only a loud clang was heard, and Thor's hammer was easily parried away. One must know that in countless battles over 1,000 years ago, the destroyer armor existed as Odin's battle armor. It accompanied Odin through who knows how many years, but because Odin had not been so obsessed with war in recent years, the destroyer armor gradually retreated behind the scenes, rarely known to others. But even so, it was still entrusted with important duties by Odin, responsible for guarding Asgard's most crucial god king's secret vault. Where the destroyer armor was essentially where Odin was. Of course, the premise for all this was that the destroyer armor was operated by Odin, only then could it unleash its greatest power. But now that this item had fallen into Loki's hands, the power it could exert had decreased by an unknown amount. But even so, it parried Thor's hammer with unusual ease. In terms of the materials used for crafting, their most basic composition involved large amounts of uru alloy. However, in different aspects, they both contained other miraculous substances. For example, Thor's hammer integrated a dead star's core. As for what the destroyer armor integrated, no one knew. But there was no doubt that even if Thor was at the peak of his power, he might not be able to defeat this destroyer armor. A draw between them would already be quite good, let alone now that Thor had been stripped of his divine power by Odin, and his own strength could not be unleashed quickly at all. It was only because Loki was controlling this destroyer armor now. If it were Odin, he would have been killed long ago. Even so, the situation Thor faced was still very grim. Perhaps he could survive at the hands of the destroyer armor, but everyone else might very well be completely wiped out, just like Zhou Yang. While Thor's hammer was restraining the destroyer armor, Thor had quickly flown to Zhou Yang's side. However, to his surprise, although Zhou Yang had taken a full power blow from the destroyer armor, and even looked like he had been torn into countless pieces, there was no trace of Zhou Yang there, not even a shred of a corpse remained. Even the destroyer armor couldn't do that. And most importantly, the unfinished Thor's hammer belonging to Zhou Yang was completely gone. This cunning fellow. Thor couldn't help but chuckle. Zhou Yang was far smarter than he thought. When his own condition was clearly extremely weak, he wouldn't go up and fight the destroyer armor to the death. Not only would that be unhelpful to the battle situation, but he would very likely become a burden to Thor. Furthermore, his death would also make Loki overlook his existence. After all, separated by countless light years, even if Loki could see everything happening on Earth through the God King's throne, he might not be able to see through the illusion Zhou Yang cast across countless light years. And most crucially, the destroyer armor also concealed some of the energy fluctuations when the illusion was cast for Zhou Yang, making it even harder for him to detect. Since Zhou Yang wasn't dead, Thor could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Now, he could focus all his strength on dealing with this destroyer armor. With a bang, after Thor's hammer fiercely collided with the destroyer armor once, he retrieved it back into his hand. This time, he stood in front of the destroyer armor again, his eyes fixed on the destroyer armor's mask, staring at Loki behind that mask. Although Thor had recovered some of his power now, it was actually more of the power of Thor's hammer, not power belonging to Thor himself. Although it was said that before losing his divine power, Thor's fame throughout the 9 realms relied more on the power of Thor's hammer, his own strength should not be underestimated. Without powerful strength, it would have been impossible for him to gain the recognition of Thor's hammer. But now, although Thor could rely on his connection with Thor's hammer to use some of its power, without his own powerful strength as a foundation, he simply couldn't fully unleash the power of Thor's hammer. Loki, my brother, can you finally not bear it any longer? Thor's gaze seemed to be able to penetrate the destroyer armor's mask, meeting the gaze of Loki, who was currently sitting on Asgard's God King's throne, from afar. Only by sitting upon the God King's throne could Loki control this destroyer armor across countless light years. At Thor's words, a hint of disdain appeared at the corner of his mouth. This time, he wasn't the one who couldn't bear it first. If Thor hadn't tried to summon the Rainbow Bridge and return to Asgard, he wouldn't have had to strike first and destroy everything, including the persistent Thor. On Earth, the destroyer armor took a step forward. The mask on it opened again, and fire blazed within the furnace. This was enough to express his attitude. Loki, I don't know what I did to make you go down this wrong path, but I sincerely hope you can turn back. It's not too late now, Loki, turn back. Thor looked sincerely at the destroyer armor in front of him. Although he knew this might have no effect, he had to say it. Hey! In the surrounding space, Loki's scornful laughter seemed to echo. The next moment, an energy beam carrying endless destruction shot directly towards Thor. And at the instant the destructive beam erupted, Thor swung Thor's hammer and smashed it directly forward. Thor's hammer and the destructive beam collided fiercely. The forces between them met in a direct, unreserved head-on clash, and immediately after, Thor was sent flying. However, just as the destroyer armor took a step forward, preparing to continue attacking Thor, a figure suddenly descended from midair. A giant longsword, 2 meters long, instantly pierced the destroyer armor's chest, pinning it firmly to the ground. The one who struck was Sif, who had leapt into the air at some unknown moment. She was one of the only 2 Asgardians present who could damage the destroyer armor. The longsword in her hand was a divine artifact personally bestowed by Odin, crafted in imitation of Odin's God King's sword, possessing extremely strong power. If discussing her personal strength, Sif was not even comparable to any of the warriors 3. But who could help that she had already been recognized as Asgard's next queen of the gods from a very young age. Therefore, she had been deliberately cultivated since she was very young. If solely based on her own efforts, Sif would likely be like the warriors 3, her strength forever limited below the divine level. However, precisely because she was recognized as Asgard's next queen of the gods early on, after she grew up, even though she had not yet grown to the limit of her power, she had already been granted divine authority by Odin, becoming Asgard's goddess of land and harvest. The magic longsword in her hand was a divine-level weapon granted to Sif by Odin, containing immense divine power. Only this weapon possessed the ability to damage the destroyer armor. This was also why Volstagg, Hogun, and Fandral did not actively step forward to provoke the destroyer armor. Pierced by a single sword, the destroyer armor was firmly pinned to the ground, and the fire in its head slowly extinguished, which made everyone breathe a sigh of relief. Up to this point, Stark had not participated in the battle. He had been helping Professor Shagav and Jane Foster evacuate earlier. Coulson was initially unwilling, but seeing the immense power of the destroyer armor, he wisely retreated quickly. As for Jo Young, in this current area, no one knows where he is hiding, except for Thor. Although Loki was currently commanding the destroyer armor, he was doing so through the God King's throne and the Eternal Spear. His own spirit was not invested in it, as he was countless light years away. If anything went wrong, his portion of spirit would likely be greatly affected. And when the destroyer armor slowly came to a halt, the first person to rush out was surprisingly Coulson. He drove a car, rapidly approaching from a distance. He was extremely interested in this powerful destroyer armor. However, just as Coulson was driving the car rapidly closer, and everyone couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief, a fiery glow suddenly flashed within the destroyer armor's furnace, and in an instant, it began to burn fiercely. Even in less than a blink of an eye, the massive silver armor, the steel plates all over its body, twisted freely as if they were liquid. The front and back, in just a blink of an eye, had completely flipped over. The massive fire furnace aimed at Sif, who was standing on its chest. The destructive beam, erupting like angry flames, grazed Sif's ear and shot towards the endless high sky. Sif reacted extremely quickly, abandoning her magic longsword at the most critical moment. But even so, a large section of her long black hair was directly vaporized. One can imagine how tragic the consequences would have been if her head had been directly hit. Sif was thrown heavily to the ground, but before she could even cry out in pain, she quickly jumped up and shouted loudly towards Volstagg and the others in the distance, "Retreat, retreat quickly, put distance between yourselves and it." Although fighting the destroyer armor at close range is the only way to destroy it, if you fight it at close range before finding a way to counter it, you are simply asking for a quick death. The seemingly endless destructive beams, the crisscrossing thunder and lightning, coupled with the occasional palm blasts, made the battle in the desert extremely intense and spectacular for a while, captivating the Americans who were carefully observing this scene via satellite, making them unwilling to blink. And Jo Young, hidden in the shadows, had no intention of making a move even now. Firstly, his own magic power had not yet recovered to its strongest state. Secondly, he did not feel that the current war was worth his intervention, unless there was something that could move him and bring him some gain. This war itself was Odin's test and motivation for Thor, and everything was under Odin's control. Although Loki is called the god of lies and mischief, what about Odin? Odin is the All-Father of Asgard, the God King, who presides over various divine powers such as prophecy, kingship, wisdom, healing, magic, poetry, war, and death. How could Loki possibly outscheme Odin? Regardless of how powerful the destroyer armor is in this war, it will inevitably end with Thor's defeat, and it can only be defeated by Thor. This is the real reason Jo Young is unwilling to intervene. If he shows insufficient strength, he might be heavily beaten by the destroyer armor. If he shows too much strength, he might be targeted by Odin, who would command the destroyer armor to beat him heavily, and the outcome would be no different. However, he cannot not make a move, because at this time, too many people are watching from various angles. Now is also the best time for him to show his strength. Jo Young had already been targeted for a long time. Ever since he completed the magic circle for summoning the Rainbow Bridge for Thor, countless people began to secretly plot. If they could make Jo Young redraw a magic circle to summon the Rainbow Bridge after Thor left, wouldn't that mean they could invade Asgard via the Rainbow Bridge at any time? Just having such a thought was enough for many people to take risks. To be honest, if Jo Young were a bit more sinister and did as they requested, then after the magic circle for summoning the Rainbow Bridge was opened, sending those people into Asgard, no, perhaps before those people could reach Asgard, Heimdall would destroy them all midway. However, it's best to avoid such troublesome matters if possible. Who knows what kind of twists and turns might occur in the middle. So Jo Young must find an opportunity to heavily hit the destroyer armor twice, but after one strike, he must quickly retreat. Show enough power, but not appear overly strong, so that those who want to scheme against him must weigh the price they have to pay, but not be so strong that some people unite to plot against him, otherwise, he would truly be an enemy of the whole world. While Zhou Yang was secretly calculating people's hearts, the power of the destroyer armor was strongly displayed. The destructive beam with a diameter of 1 meter directly vaporized all space on the desert, instantly arriving in front of Thor. Although Thor's hammer was moved to Thor's chest in time, under the attack unleashed by the destroyer armor with almost all its power, Thor was still sent flying, severely impacted a kilometer away, and even Thor's hammer was forced out of his hand by the immense force. Such an attack by the destroyer armor was not without cost. Stark's palm blasts simultaneously bombarded the destroyer armor without reservation. A high-intensity energy attack lasting 10 seconds landed on the destroyer armor, yet it failed to move it even half a step. After knocking Thor away, the destroyer armor immediately turned around, facing Stark's palm blasts with its chest. The next moment, the magma-red energy beam directly struck Stark, and in an instant, it sent him flying horizontally along the ground. Due to the curvature of the Earth, Stark was even sent flying into the air. The power of the destroyer armor was evident. It could be said that almost no one on Earth was its match. At this moment, the American president in the White House couldn't help but ask about the deployment of space-based weapons and the preparation procedures for nuclear bombs. Should the destroyer armor show any signs of leaving the desert, nuclear bombs would be used immediately, even if it meant destroying half of New Mexico. However, the destroyer armor had little interest in Earth. Its true interest was only one, and that was Thor. The 3-meter-tall silver armor had huge strides and moved very quickly. In an instant, the destroyer armor strode towards Thor, who was lying on the ground. Loki's goal was only one: to kill Thor. Walking forward step by step, Thor reappeared in the destroyer armor's sight. At the same time, the destroyer armor's fire furnace reopened. At this moment, one destroyer armor had already made everyone too busy to fend for themselves. In this critical situation, almost no one could arrive in time to save Thor, who was in a life-or-death predicament. Even Thor now understood that if the destroyer armor unleashed its full energy attack, he would surely die here. Thor stretched out a hand, and Thor's hammer, not far away, immediately began to vibrate again, attempting to fly back into Thor's hand. But at this moment, the fiery red destructive beam shot through, stirring up sand, and Thor's hammer was also heavily struck and sent flying. The destroyer armor walked step by step to Thor's front. The flames inside the furnace armor constantly flickered, just like Loki's agitated mind behind it. Although Loki desperately wanted to kill Thor, as this moment arrived, his heart was still extremely complicated. Did Loki truly want to kill Thor? Of course, this had been his long-held wish, but did he truly have the heart to kill Thor? So, just as Loki hesitated for a moment, a flash of light suddenly appeared in front of the destroyer armor's eyes. Loki instantly became alert, and the destroyer armor's furnace was about to unleash an endless destructive beam, but it was already too late. A white lightning bolt suddenly appeared in front of the destroyer armor. Before anyone, including Loki, could react, it was like a gently dancing sprite, instantly leaping into the destroyer armor's steel furnace. A boom echoed from the fire furnace, followed by Loki's exasperated voice. All this time, Loki had not spoken to Thor, because he didn't know what to say to the brother he was about to kill. This made it seem as if he could only control the destroyer armor in battle but could not make it speak. But thinking carefully, if he could command even more complex and difficult battles, let alone merely speaking. And this instantly showed everyone a way to defeat the destroyer armor. The destroyer armor was indeed incredibly powerful, with energy beams strong enough to destroy everything, steel armor that could withstand even Thor's hammer, and Stark's palm blasts, plus a perverted regeneration ability that allowed it to easily break free and recover even after being pierced by Sif's magic longsword. This almost invincible monster made almost everyone feel despair. But now, this sudden attack immediately gave everyone a direction to defeat the destroyer armor. If it couldn't be destroyed from the outside, then find a way to start from the inside. As long as the destroyer armor's internal program could be destroyed, it could be completely destroyed. The destroyer armor's destructive beam was indeed the most powerful, but it was also its weakest point. However, just as everyone's confidence was ignited, reality poured cold water on them again. In the void, countless extremely fine lightning bolts suddenly appeared and instantly struck the destroyer armor's open furnace mask. However, at that very moment, a powerful destructive beam suddenly erupted. The countless incoming lightning bolts were hit head-on by the destructive beam. Under the powerful attack, all those lightning bolts were annihilated by the destructive beam, without even stirring up a single energy splash. Indeed, perhaps the destroyer armor's internal control system was its greatest weakness, but at the same time, it was also its strongest point. No one could withstand the incredibly powerful destructive beam and attack the destroyer armor's interior. Zhou Yang's previous attack was effective, largely due to the element of surprise. To be precise, it was a sneak attack. The destructive beam swept around, clearing all the lightning energy in the surrounding space. At this point, the destroyer armor also looked at Thor, and at Zhou Yang, who was currently helping Thor up and quickly escaping. Why did Zhou Yang make his move just now? Wasn't the purpose to save Thor? As long as Thor was present, they had a chance to hit the destroyer armor. However, how could Loki easily let Thor escape? The destroyer armor did not stop at all. In an instant, the powerful destructive beam directly shot towards Zhou Yang and Thor's backs. The destructive beam with a diameter of 1 meter enveloped half of their bodies, giving them no chance to escape. Boom! The destructive beam, which had been charging for a long time, was only intercepted for half a moment. The next moment, it had already pierced through Zhou Yang and Thor's bodies, and their two half-bodies were thrown into the desert like that. Is Thor dead? Thor isn't dead. Everyone looked at Thor's corpse in disbelief at the first moment, but the first one to realize that Thor would absolutely not die so easily was Loki. He knew Thor too well. Even if Thor died, he wouldn't die so easily, he couldn't die so easily. The destroyer armor took another step forward, and the pure white destroyer beam erupted again, charging directly towards the remains Thor left behind. Then, in an extremely short amount of time, the remains Thor left behind were directly vaporized and disappeared without a trace by the aftermath of the destroyer beam. No, the destroyer beam didn't even directly hit Thor's remains, it was just the surrounding ripples of the aftermath that destroyed Thor's remains a step earlier. It's hard to imagine how fragile that body was. The physical strength of Asgardians isn't that weak. Only Loki noticed these extremely small details. The others on Earth, even including Stark, didn't notice the problem. They were even still shocked by the deaths of Thor and Zhou Yang, and hated Loki for his cruel act of not even sparing their remains. However, before they could take any action, the destroyer armor suddenly turned around, and the dazzling destroyer beam shot directly down towards Thor's hammer that had fallen tens of meters away. But this time, the destroyer beam was blocked. It was Thor, who had picked up Thor's hammer a step earlier, who blocked it. Thor, whose body was completely unharmed, had firmly blocked the destroyer beam with Thor's hammer, and standing not far behind him was Zhou Yang, holding another Thor's hammer. What exactly happened just now? When everyone looked at Zhou Yang and Thor appearing with bewildered faces, Stark involuntarily muttered in the communication channel, "Illusion, that just now should have been an illusion." Compared to these people, Sif and the Warriors 3 from Asgard were calmer. When Thor was killed by the destroyer armor just now, they had already begun to doubt the authenticity of that scene. Thor is not that easy to kill, and even if it were them themselves, being defeated head-on by the destroyer beam might cause them to vomit blood and die, but it definitely wouldn't specifically destroy their bodies. The destroyer beam is indeed very powerful, but to destroy the body of an Asgardian deity, it's not just a matter of energy, there's also the influence of laws. The destroyer armor might eventually be able to destroy Thor's remains, but this requires prolonged wear and tear and a massive input of energy, which is absolutely not that simple. So from the beginning, they suspected that Thor wasn't dead at all. And now, seeing Thor finally appear, and also seeing Zhou Yang standing behind Thor, they immediately understood that he was a powerful mage. As if sensing the gaze of Sif and the Warriors 3, Zhou Yang suddenly turned his head and smiled at them. The next moment, countless bolts of thunder and lightning suddenly flashed from Thor's hammer in his hand, and when this scene faded, another Thor, wearing silver armor, a bright red cape, and holding Thor's hammer, appeared before everyone's eyes. Seeing this scene, everyone was slightly stunned at first, but then they immediately understood that it was Zhou Yang. Zhou Yang had transformed into Thor using his illusion ability. In the current situation, putting everything else aside, just the Thor's hammer in Zhou Yang's hand could provide enough confusion. In an instant, Zhou Yang had strode forward and stood shoulder to shoulder with Thor. The Thor's hammer in their hands simultaneously emitted a strong radiance. The two Thor's hammers side by side simultaneously withstood the impact of the destroyer beam. The next moment, the two Thor's hammers were simultaneously pushed forward by the two Thors, charging towards the destroyer armor while enduring the destroyer beam. If Loki were on Earth right now, Jo-young would definitely not dare to play like this, but he is merely using the destroyer armor from Asgard to deal with Thor, and his various abilities cannot be fully utilized. Furthermore, to be blunt, he doesn't have much control over the destroyer armor. In fact, even including Thor, they have no idea of the formidable strength the destroyer armor possesses. If it were King Laufey of the Frost Giants here, or perhaps other opponents of Odin, when they saw the destroyer armor appear, their first thought wouldn't be to go up and contend with the destroyer armor, but rather to charge forward, use themselves as bait to attract the destroyer armor's attention and then let their fellow clansmen quickly retreat. This is the terrifying aspect of the destroyer armor. Its fearsome reputation was forged through battle after battle. Right now, to be blunt, the power displayed by the destroyer armor is not even 1/10 of its full potential. Regardless, the appearance of the two Thors immediately disrupted Loki's thoughts. Moreover, under the cover of the two Thor's hammers, Loki is now not entirely certain whether the real Thor is the one he just said he locked onto, or if they have swapped positions. Furthermore, at this moment, Loki already saw the two Thors' plan very clearly. Their goal is simply to use Thor's hammer to withstand the destroyer beam, charge towards the destroyer armor, and then, while the destroyer armor's faceplate is open, use Thor's hammer to endure the destroyer beam and get inside the destroyer's core to detonate the destroyer armor directly from within. You have to admit, this is a good strategy, and it can even be said to truly grasp the destroyer armor's weakness. But is it really that easy? If that were truly the case, then the destroyer armor, having fought in the Nine Realms for countless years, would have been taken advantage of and destroyed countless times by now. But it is still here today, while its enemies have long since disappeared into some corner of the universe, whereabouts unknown. Under Loki's impetus, the destroyer armor was still spewing out a powerful destroyer beam. The two Thor's hammers, working together, used their formidable lightning power to withstand the destroyer beam and charge towards the destroyer armor. The distance between them grew closer and closer. Just as they were only an arm's length away from the destroyer armor's core, the destroyer armor moved. Both of its arms extended simultaneously, and the two steel arms simultaneously grabbed towards the two Thor's hammers. Seeing this scene, it was Jo-young, not Thor, whose hair stood on end first, though from their appearance, you couldn't tell who was who. Retreat, quickly retreat, he wants to take your Thor's hammer. As soon as the words fell, the two Thors simultaneously retreated rapidly to the sides. The destroyer armor's destroyer beam could only sweep left and right, and for a moment, it couldn't determine which of the two Thors was real. Does that mean the destroyer armor has the power to lift Thor's hammer? Stark, in his gold and red iron armor, suddenly landed beside Sif and the warriors three. With his faceplate open, he asked the four people with a solemn expression. It should be possible, right? Sif wasn't very sure about this question. Even as the goddess of land and harvest in Asgard, Sif wasn't very clear about the deep-seated secrets of Asgard. After all, she was only recognized by Odin and Frigga and would become the next queen of the gods of Asgard in the future, which is not the same as saying she is already the queen of the gods of Asgard now. There is still a big difference. However, among the four people present, there was someone who knew the destroyer armor quite well. This person was none other than Volstagg. Absolutely, I've seen the destroyer armor wield Thor's hammer more than once. Volstagg gave a definitive answer. Among everyone present involved in this matter, Volstagg was the oldest. Especially compared to youngsters like Thor, who are only 1,000 years old, Volstagg has entered the middle to late stage of an Asgardian's life. His strength had long since declined from its peak, but even so, he was still the most powerful among them, aside from Thor and Sif. It can even be said that even though Sif already possessed the divine authority of the goddess of land and harvest of Asgard, if it came down to a life and death struggle, she might not necessarily be a match for a top-tier demigod like Volstagg. Demigods are in an awkward position. Those with weak power aren't even comparable to some legendary mages, while those with strong power can even contend with a powerful deity. They are not weak at all in terms of power bursts, they just can't match powerful deities in terms of sustained power. Volstagg back then was definitely a top-tier warrior fighting on the front lines. Otherwise, he wouldn't have seen the destroyer armor wielding Thor's hammer, and more than once. In other words, the sudden retreat just now was the correct move for Thor and Jo Young. If the destroyer armor had directly taken Thor's hammer from their hands at that moment, then their combat ability would have been completely gone. Jo Young was fine. Although Thor's hammer greatly enhanced his strength, his true trump card wasn't the power of Thor's hammer. It could even be said that even if he lost Thor's hammer, it wouldn't have any impact on the breakout of his top-tier power. However, with Thor's hammer, he could unleash multiple bursts of power for a long time, whereas without Thor's hammer, he would have to finish the fight quickly. But it's different for Thor. Once he loses Thor's hammer for a long time and is unable to regain his divine authority, he is very likely to degenerate into Donald Blake. At that time, Thor will have to fall into slumber again. Jo Young figured this out not because he understood the destroyer armor so well, but because he clearly remembered that in the future, Vision was definitely among those who could easily lift Thor's hammer. Vision is not a traditional life form and doesn't need to adhere to Thor's hammer's strict test. As long as he has enough strength, he can lift Thor's hammer. And the strength of the destroyer armor in front of them is definitely not even slightly lower than Vision's, it might even be stronger. Once it takes Thor's hammer, even Thor will have no power to resist. The destroyer armor's target was still Thor, so in the blink of an eye, countless Thors appeared around the destroyer armor. These Thors were a mix of real and fake. There was the real Thor, illusory phantoms, and the fake Thor created by Jo Young's illusion. For a moment, the destroyer armor didn't know who to attack. However, the destroyer armor was the destroyer armor after all. Its powerful destroyer beam swept in all directions, and in an instant, the countless illusory Thors that had appeared on the ground were all cleared away. Only 2 Thors remained on the ground. And these 2 Thors were the hardest to distinguish, because not only did they look exactly alike, but even the Thors' hammers in their hands were extremely similar. Unless observed from close range, you simply couldn't tell the difference between them. But Loki, sitting in the hall of the Divine King in Asgard at this moment, let out a cold laugh. The next moment, the destroyer armor on Earth directly lunged towards one of the Thors. It only needed to eliminate one of them, and then no matter whether the other was real or fake, he would be able to distinguish it. And at worst, he could just eliminate both. For him, it was just a little more effort. And in fact, the destroyer armor was truly lucky. The one it targeted was the real Thor. Thor's hammer sped Thor across the desert. For Thor, what he needed most right now was to put distance between himself and the destroyer armor. He needed to regroup and then charge back at the destroyer armor. There was nothing he could do. Thor had not fully recovered his complete strength yet. Frankly speaking, the main reason he could be here was the power of Thor's hammer. Although he now had Thor's body back, without divine authority, he couldn't fully unleash the power of Thor's hammer, and his current body couldn't fully bear this power, so he needed to take a break. However, at this moment, whether Loki had some other method or was simply lucky, the destroyer armor locked onto Thor immediately. While chasing Thor with heavy strides, a powerful destroyer beam shot directly from behind Thor. In the disbelieving eyes of everyone, the destroyer beam struck Thor's hammer on Thor's back, instantly sending it flying. Thor himself was violently knocked down onto the desert, rolling uncontrollably in the sand. Before he could even get up, he couldn't help but spit out 2 mouthfuls of Sandman. At this moment, the destroyer armor's destroyer beam followed closely behind, chasing him down. Thor lay on the ground, unable to get up in time, but at the critical moment, Thor's hammer quickly flew into his hand, blocking the fierce destroyer beam directly in front of him. Even so, Thor, along with Thor's hammer, was pushed back continuously by the powerful destroyer beam. He lay on the desert, a deep trench carved by the powerful destroyer beam. Seeing that Thor was likely unable to hold on, everyone else who could fight rushed forward at this moment. The first to strike was none other than Stark. This time, he brought his hands together and pushed them forward side by side. In an instant, an energy beam as thick as a bowl slammed violently into the side of the destroyer armor's head. The immense power caused the destroyer armor's body to tilt. With that single strike, the destroyer beam swept fiercely across the desert beside Thor. Sand and rocks flew, swirling in the air. You could even smell the pungent odor of the sand being charred, which made it easy to imagine how tragic the outcome would be if a person's skin were hit by the destroyer beam. Naturally, Jo Young was the next to attack. After fighting the destroyer armor for so long, he had already understood that neither on a magic level nor a physical level could they destroy the destroyer armor unless Odin himself abandoned the destroyer armor. In the original timeline, Thor, as a normal person, was killed by the destroyer armor, but in the instant of death, he suddenly awakened and gained the power to match Thor's hammer, which allowed him to finally use Thor's hammer to destroy the destroyer armor. But was this truly the case? The reason Thor died was that he was killed by the destroyer armor. He was willing to sacrifice himself to save others' lives. However, the problem was, even if he didn't die, he could still achieve this. So why did he need to die? Furthermore, the level of Thor's hammer might not be higher than that of the destroyer armor, but in the end, Thor's hammer destroyed the destroyer armor. If Odin hadn't intervened, how could Thor have destroyed the destroyer armor so easily? And most importantly, the destroyer armor possessed extremely powerful regenerative capabilities. On the surface, it seemed that Thor did destroy the destroyer armor, but was that really the truth? Was the destroyer armor truly destroyed? It was likely all part of Odin's calculations and intervention. Perhaps when Thor was on the verge of death, even if he still didn't have the qualification to wield Thor's hammer, Odin, left with no choice, returned his divine authority to him, along with Thor's hammer. In other words, if Thor could awaken his divine authority without dying, he would still have the ability to defeat the destroyer armor. As for Thor's final outcome, Jo-young didn't care much about it now. What he valued was whether he could influence the destroyer armor by exerting his full capabilities. This was an excellent test and demonstration of his personal ability. Jo-young didn't attack the destroyer armor directly with energy attacks like Thor and Stark. He focused more on hitting some of the destroyer armor's vital parts, using his strong points to attack the opponent's weak points. This was the way of a mage. The destroyer armor was indeed very powerful, but besides its most powerful and crucial weakness, the destroyer furnace, in Jo-young's eyes, it had many other issues. If the person controlling the destroyer armor was Odin, then Jo-young wouldn't be able to see anything. But now that it was Loki, there were many areas that couldn't be fully managed. Jo-young closed and opened his eyes, completely activating his magic vision. The destroyer armor that appeared in his eyes, besides countless solid uru alloy, was surrounded by circles and circles of strange and complex magic runes all over its body, forming peculiar rune light bands that enveloped the entire destroyer armor. Many of these magic runes were ones Jo-young had never seen before. Frankly speaking, if this destroyer armor could be completely disassembled and analyzed, Jo-young might even be able to obtain all the runes. But things weren't that simple. This destroyer armor was jointly created by Odin and the leader of the dwarves. The magic runes on it were personally arranged by Odin. Even if Jo-young could see some peculiar runes, in that endless ocean of runes, those magic runes were fleeting, he couldn't see them clearly at all. Frankly speaking, if the person controlling this destroyer armor now was Odin, then Jo-young would only see a mass of colorful light in his eyes, unable to see any rune at all. Only when Loki was controlling this magic rune with insufficient strength did it give Jo-young that tiny bit of opportunity. At this moment, almost everyone's attention was focused on Thor and the destroyer armor. Even Odin and Heimdall, who were secretly watching all of this, subconsciously overlooked Jo-young's actions. The Thor's hammer in Jo-young's hand didn't smash and crash like Thor's. For him, Thor's hammer was more like a magic item, an artifact for assisting in casting spells, rather than a direct attack weapon. Thor's hammer floated in front of Jo-young, and in his hands, his 10 fingers quickly outlined one magic rune after another. Thunder divine power quickly filled them, finally forming a dazzling golden rune magic array. However, this scene completely disappeared in an instant. The next moment, hundreds of lightning bolts as fine as hair appeared beside the destroyer armor's left leg, and then, like a school of small fish, they directly rushed towards the destroyer armor's left leg. All these attacks seemed relatively simple, but no one noticed the faint blue light flickering at the tip of these hair-thin lightning bolts. Everyone only saw the destroyer armor constantly chasing Thor, but it had only taken a few steps when its forward momentum suddenly stopped. The next moment, like a collapsing mountain or falling jade pillar, the destroyer armor suddenly plunged face first onto the ground. What happened? Everyone's attention was on Thor and the destroyer armor just now, and Jo-young's attack was very concealed. After one strike, Thor's hammer in his hand had already flown towards Thor. On the surface, it seemed to have hit him, but it used very little force to help Thor up, and at this time, the destroyer armor also got back up. However, this time, let alone top masters like Stark, even Coulson, who was watching the scene from afar, could see that something was wrong with the destroyer armor's left foot. It seemed to be supporting its entire body with only its right foot, as if its left foot couldn't exert any strength. Haha, there was no need to think about it now. Everyone began to relentlessly attack this weakness of the destroyer armor. Not only Tony Stark and the recovered Thor, but no one expected that the fastest runner was Volstagg, one of the Warriors 3. In the blink of an eye, Volstagg had already run in front of the destroyer armor, nimbly dodging the destroyer armor's hand interceptions, and slammed the huge hammer in his hand fiercely onto the destroyer armor's right leg. The destroyer armor was standing on only one right leg. Although no one knew exactly what had caused its left leg to become useless, if they could knock down this right leg now, the destroyer armor would only be able to sit there and take hits. Although the destroyer armor still possessed a powerful destroyer beam, a turret that could only remain stationary was far inferior to a tank that could move at any time. However, just as Volstagg excitedly thought he was about to make a contribution, with a bang, Volstagg's large figure was fiercely kicked away. It was the destroyer armor that delivered the kick, and it used its right leg. That's right, in everyone's utterly astonished eyes, the destroyer armor suddenly floated up, standing suspended in midair. This destroyer armor could actually fly. This was truly astonishing. Of course, the destroyer armor could fly. Although it hadn't shown this ability before, it didn't mean it didn't have the ability. Just as Stark designed his Iron Man armor to maximize its overall capabilities, how could the mighty Allfather Odin not consider its comprehensive combat capabilities when designing his armor? And even if he didn't consider this during design and manufacturing, in countless wars afterward, he would discover this weakness and quickly compensate for it. And now, the destroyer armor floating in midair had proven this point. However, Jo Young on the side did not feel any frustration because of this. His lightning attack just now had proven that he could cause damage to the destroyer armor, and this meant he could cause damage to all enemies in the world less powerful than the destroyer armor. Using the power of lightning to propel spatial energy was the only way Jo Young could think of using spatial power at the moment. And it was precisely this spatial energy that caused problems in the destroyer armor's internal structure, rendering one of its legs useless. Although Jo Young had already mastered spatial runes and had even drawn the Rainbow Bridge summoning magic array based on spatial runes, this did not mean he had mastered the combat methods of spatial power. One could even say he was currently like a baby learning to speak. However, this did not mean Jo Young had no options at all. When Jo Young first mastered spatial energy, although he largely relied on the spatial runes provided by Thor, what truly enabled him to do so was the incredibly powerful Thunder Divine Power. When immensely powerful and condensed Thunder Divine Power gathered together, and then erupted with powerful energy, in an instant, it had already penetrated space. This was not the speed of light application of lightning power, but directly using lightning power to break space, thereby destroying the spatial structure. This was actually the most basic application method of spatial energy. If this application method of energy were expanded, there was once a very fitting name to describe this combat method, and its name was Spatial Blade. Having succeeded with one hand, Jo Young stopped attacking, and at this moment, his Thor's hammer also landed in Thor's arms. To be honest, it was actually more like supporting him. A delicate force directly helped Thor up from the ground, and after Thor had fully stood firm, the Thor's hammer belonging to Jo Young also jumped into Thor's hand. With this, Thor instantly held two Thor's hammers simultaneously. The powerful thunder force instantly surged from the two Thor's hammers onto him, and Thor's aura became even stronger in the blink of an eye. Holding both Thor's hammers tightly, Thor looked at Jo Young on the other side with a face full of surprise. One must know that Thor had previously given this Thor's hammer to Jo Young, so it now completely belonged to Jo Young. And now Jo Young had given this Thor's hammer into Thor's hand. Of course, this was not the meaning of returning it, but merely lending it temporarily. But even so, it was not something an ordinary person could do. Looking at the surprise on Thor's face, Jo Young merely bowed slightly, his smile very calm. The next moment, his entire body was directly shattered into countless pieces by the powerful destroyer beam. The destroyer armor certainly wouldn't let Jo Young go. While others might not understand what was happening, Loki certainly did. Although the spatial barrier prevented him from knowing how Jo Young achieved this step, it didn't hinder him from locking onto the true culprit responsible for this scene. However, as a legendary mage, or directly speaking, as a legendary wizard, Jo Young was in no way inferior to Loki in terms of cunning and deviousness. It was only because Loki was older that he was more powerful than him. Otherwise, if they were at the same power level, it would be hard to say who would live and who would die. Zhou Yang's illusion had just been destroyed by the destroyer armor. The next moment, a huge clap of thunder suddenly sounded above everyone's heads. The next moment, large raindrops had already fallen from the sky, landing on the desert. At this moment, the Asgardians, including Sif, the Warriors 3, and Thor, were all instantly filled with renewed spirit. They were all too familiar with this kind of combat environment. Many times Thor is directly called the Thunder God, but many people don't know that his divine authority is not limited to thunder. As he himself said, he is the noise of the rain, the will of the wind. Mortals call me the bringer of thunder, the singer of lightning. I am the next god king of the Aesir, the son of Allfather Odin. I am Thor. Wind, rain, thunder, and lightning are all within the scope of Thor's divine authority. In the past, when he fought to his heart's content, it was also accompanied by endless wind, rain, and thunder. Just like now, even in the desert, countless water vapor was frantically gathered. Without knowing when, dark and thick storm clouds had already formed high in the sky, and lightning as thick as a child's arm constantly darted within them. The sound of thunder had already echoed throughout the heavens and earth. And at this moment, Zhou Yang had disappeared. As the heavy rain fell, Loki, on the God King's throne in faraway Alaska, was preparing to search for Zhou Yang's whereabouts, because in his view, the guy who was almost as small as an ant before had now become a stumbling block. It could even be said without exaggeration that as long as Zhou Yang was present, Loki would have no chance of easily killing Thor. However, just as Loki was about to look for Zhou Yang through the destroyer armor, he suddenly felt the destroyer armor's vision begin to become blurred. Although he immediately enhanced the destroyer armor's surrounding perception, and everything became clear again, for some reason, he always felt there was something indescribable and unclear in places he couldn't detect, desperately pulling at his power. However, before Loki could figure all this out, a huge thunderhammer had already smashed fiercely in front of his eyes. With a bang, the destroyer armor's arm, which was raised in time, was actually smashed high up. The power attached to the Thor's hammer far exceeded before. And immediately after, another Thor's hammer also smashed directly and fiercely from the front, hitting the chest of the destroyer armor, which couldn't react in time. The destroyer armor, flying in midair, was instantly smashed dozens of meters away. Loki, located on the God King's throne in Alaska, stood up in surprise. What was going on? Had Thor recovered his full power? Loki was most aware of Thor's current state. Even with just Thor's hammer, Loki dared not confront Thor head-on. And once Thor recovered his own divine power, the combination of the two might make it difficult for the destroyer armor to do anything to him. However, in an instant, Loki was completely relieved, because at this moment, the eternal spear tightly held in his right hand transmitted a cold sensation, and it was this feeling that completely calmed him down. The highest authority in Asgard was now in his hands. Without his permission, Thor simply couldn't recover his divine authority. What he needed to do now was to break the false power Thor possessed on Earth. A dazzling destroyer beam pierced through the endless rain curtain, fiercely shooting towards Thor, who was striding forward to kill. However, at this moment, a long sword suddenly thrust straight up from the ground, piercing through the chest and abdomen of the destroyer armor in an instant, causing its body to involuntarily tilt. The powerful destroyer beam instantly missed its target. The one who attacked at this moment was none other than Sif. Don't let her appearance with a long sword in a Valkyrie stance fool you. In reality, few people know that her long sword, modeled after Odin's God King's sword, is essentially a magic weapon. It not only has the ability to be recalled at any time but also possesses the skill of automatic remote combat. And it was this sudden strike that allowed Thor to seize the initiative. In an instant, Thor had already rushed in front of the destroyer armor. The two Thor's hammers had somehow returned to his hands simultaneously, held tightly by him, and he smashed them fiercely towards the destroyer armor's chest. Again and again, Thor hammered the destroyer armor's chest like beating a drum, instead of attacking the destroyer armor's destroyer furnace. No, that's not right. Thor was indeed attacking the destroyer armor's destroyer furnace at this time. Don't look at the destroyer armor emitting destroyer beams from its open mask. The real destroyer furnace, the true core of the destroyer armor, is actually in its chest. And with each powerful hammer blow, tiny bolts of thunder had already begun to penetrate into the interior of the destroyer armor. The destroyer armor looked incredibly powerful and indestructible, and it itself was an extremely difficult monster to destroy. Before, no matter how much power they used, they actually found it difficult to truly harm the destroyer armor in the slightest. However, in the final analysis, the root cause of all this was that their power was insufficient. If Thanos were to appear before the destroyer armor controlled by Loki, then frankly speaking, he could tear the destroyer armor to pieces with 3 punches and 2 kicks. And now, the one playing this role was Thor, the thunder god. Thor, holding Thor's hammers, at this moment seemed to have recovered all of his divine power. He stood in front of the destroyer armor, continuously smashing the Thor's hammers in his hands against the destroyer armor's chest. Under hammer blows filled with immense power and skill, the destroyer armor's head was constantly forced upwards, making it impossible to lower its head and attack Thor with the destroyer beam. Even worse, Thor's hammer continuously emitted tiny arcs of thunder, surging into the interior of the destroyer armor, into the fiery furnace inside the destroyer armor. Loki, located in the Hall of the Divine King in Asgard, felt all this most clearly. He controlled this powerful war machine through the destroyer armor's destroyer furnace. And now, Thor's repeated hammer blows directly affected his control over the destroyer armor. Had Thor completely recovered his power? No, the power Thor displayed was even greater than Loki had originally known. What exactly was going on? Could it be that Thor, having obtained 2 Thor's hammers, had suddenly gained such immense power? If that were the case, Thor, who had been holding 2 Thor's hammers simultaneously before, should have already recovered his power long ago. But why was it only now? Why, specifically at this moment, did Thor, holding 2 Thor's hammers, possess such immense power? Not to mention Loki, even Jo-young, who was close by, couldn't figure out what was happening. He could clearly feel the immense power of Thor at this moment. At this moment, Thor was like an incredibly vast ocean of thunder. Countless various kinds of thunder constantly moved within it, as if power that had been suppressed to its limit had suddenly completely erupted, even becoming stronger than before, reaching a miraculous realm that Jo-young couldn't even describe. All these changes happened very suddenly. Even Jo-young himself hadn't expected that when Thor held 2 Thor's hammers, he would unleash such immense power, as if the most powerful Thor had returned in an instant. He and Loki both didn't understand where the problem lay in this situation. However, no matter where the problem lay, Thor's attack continued. The 2 Thor's hammers in his hands continuously hammered the destroyer armor in front of him, and the entire destroyer armor seemed to be frozen in time, almost standing motionless in midair. This phenomenon was very strange. But Loki, located in Asgard, felt a chill in his heart at this moment, because he had already sensed that as Thor continued to smash, his control over the destroyer armor was becoming increasingly weak, and the destroyer armor was gradually breaking free from his control. Loki was not Odin after all. If it were God King Odin, he wouldn't need to control the destroyer armor through the eternal spear at all, because the destroyer armor was him, and he was the destroyer armor, there was no need for any intermediate transfer. However, Thor's repeated bombardments were causing the destroyer armor to gradually break free from Loki's control. The situation could be described as extremely unfavorable. But under these circumstances, Loki could do nothing. Although he tried to strengthen his control over the destroyer armor through the eternal spear, it was useless. Thor, on Earth, facing the destroyer armor, shattered all of Loki's attempts. With a boom, something inside the destroyer armor seemed to explode, and the next moment, the destroyer armor fell straight down from midair, landing directly in the desert. Countless mud splatters quickly covered the entire body of the destroyer armor. And following slowly down was Thor, holding 2 Thor's hammers. Endless thunder surrounded his body, constantly surging around him, making him look like a powerful deity with world-destroying energy from afar. And in fact, the current Thor was indeed a powerful deity, a deity who had recovered all his divine authority and power. Thor raised his head, looked at a certain storm cloud high above, and smiled at Jo-young hidden within the storm cloud. In the military base under the cover of night, everyone was still actively busy. Don't think the daytime war is over, the real trouble has just begun. Although very few people knew about the war that took place in the desert, those who did were all high-level government officials from various countries. They urgently needed a comprehensive analysis of the daytime war, especially whether Earth's power could withstand such a conflict. At the same time, they also needed to analyze the only spoils of war. Their time was running out, as Thor had explicitly stated that he would return to Asgard with the destroyer armor by tomorrow morning. For a while, many people didn't understand what was going on. After all, the rune magic for summoning the rainbow bridge that Thor, Jo-young, and Stark had drawn together had been destroyed. It would likely take many days to redraw it, so how could he return to Asgard tomorrow morning? Could there be something unknown hidden within this? Your power has fully recovered. Tony Stark frowned, looking at Thor, and couldn't help but ask, what exactly is going on? I owe it to Daniel. When he sent his Thor's hammer to me, my divine power awakened. Thor turned his head and looked at Jo-young, who was standing slightly in the shadows on the side, and thanked him with a very sincere smile. Thank you very much this time, Daniel. Thor's words made it sound as if everything was Jo-young's doing, as if Jo-young's Thor's hammer contained the key to awakening Thor's divine power. However, Jo-young knew that was not the case at all. Sif and the warriors three stood there on the side, smiling without speaking. Although they also had no clue how Thor had awakened his divine power, they had fought alongside Thor for hundreds of years and were already filled with confidence in Thor. No matter what desperate situation he was in, they believed he could turn things around. Jo-young took a step forward, walked into the bright light, looked at Thor, and said seriously, "You don't need to thank me. Although I did do some things, the greater factor in you being able to awaken your power lies within yourself. Regardless, congratulations. Also, does Asgard need our help? Mr. Stark and I can both go to Asgard to help you deal with Loki." Hearing Jo-young say this, Stark's eyes immediately lit up. Going to Asgard would definitely be a wonderful adventure. Although Thor had already introduced the existence of the 9 realms to the people of Earth, people who hadn't personally experienced this special existence, whether it was a planetary universe or a magic plane, couldn't clearly explain it. Unless they could personally set foot in another realm, especially a realm of gods, it was even more exciting. No need. With the destroyer armor, everything will not be a problem, including returning to Asgard, Thor said, looking at the destroyer armor that was being constantly fiddled with by a dozen researchers. However, no matter what these people did, they couldn't start the destroyer armor, let alone study anything from it overnight. It was just that Thor was in a good mood now. No matter what, Jo-young and Stark had fought alongside him in the daytime battle, and he still remembered that favor. At this moment, Jo-young's attention also shifted to the destroyer armor. After the conversation just now, many questions were explained. In other words, the destroyer armor has the power to summon the rainbow bridge, and now that Thor has the destroyer armor, he can certainly return to Asgard and easily solve Loki's trouble. It's not surprising that Thor can control the destroyer armor. Even Loki could successfully control the destroyer armor. As the legitimate heir of Asgard, and with greater strength, Thor can naturally do the same. However, Loki controlled the destroyer armor by relying on the God King's throne and the eternal spear, so it's hard to figure out how Thor achieved this. But what truly surprised Jo-young was that the destroyer armor actually possessed the power to summon the rainbow bridge, something he had never thought of before. Does the destroyer armor really have the power to summon the rainbow bridge? Jo-young was not entirely sure about this, but he couldn't completely deny it either. As far as he knew, in this world, there were many things that could truly summon the rainbow bridge: Heimdall's guardian sword, Odin's eternal spear, and later Thor's Stormbreaker. These all possessed the power to summon the rainbow bridge. Even though Asgard was completely destroyed in Ragnarok, the rainbow bridge still exists and can still be summoned through the guardian sword and Stormbreaker. This is enough to show the uniqueness of the rainbow bridge, and its relationship with Asgard is not that simple. Since the guardian sword, Stormbreaker, and eternal spear can all summon the rainbow bridge, why couldn't the destroyer armor do the same? It should be known that the destroyer armor was Odin's battle armor over 1,000 years ago. It fought alongside him for thousands of years. It's not strange at all for it to possess such special power. Or, to put it bluntly, the Thor's hammer in Thor's hand now also has the power to summon the rainbow bridge, it's just that Thor can't do it alone. But if Thor's hammer and the destroyer armor are combined, perhaps summoning the rainbow bridge is not a problem at all. Exactly how all this works will be confirmed when Thor returns to Asgard tomorrow morning. Jo-young had originally considered whether to go to Asgard with Thor. This question was difficult for him to decide because, even if things developed as he planned, the rainbow bridge would likely be directly destroyed by Thor. Without the rainbow bridge, it would be difficult for him to return to Earth. If that were the case, he might only have a chance to return to Earth when the Chitauri invasion occurred, which would delay who knows how many things. However, now that Thor had directly rejected his suggestion, Jo-young secretly breathed a sigh of relief. At least he didn't have to hesitate anymore. Staying on Earth would give him more ample preparation time to deal with the Chitauri invasion. It's a pity that if he could go to Asgard and obtain more rune knowledge, it would be of great benefit to Jo-young's strength. Jo-young originally wanted to ask Thor for more rune knowledge, but he suddenly saw Thor being invited away by Coulson. As for what they talked about, Jo-young wasn't very interested. It was just some nominal, and also unofficial, interactions between the American government and Asgard. Things like Thor's existence absolutely cannot be known to the public, as this would greatly shake their rule. However, this kind of thing cannot be absolutely certain. After all, this era is a great era where superheroes are emerging one after another. No one knows, perhaps more gods will appear tomorrow, so communicating with Thor in advance and being more prepared is also a good thing. And not long after, Jo-young saw Thor walk towards Jane Foster, but at this time, he had resumed the appearance of Donald Blake, while Sif and the Warriors 3, who were explaining some rune knowledge to Jo-young at the time, did not notice this. A complete mess. Jo-young stayed up all night. After asking Sif and the Warriors 3 for some rune knowledge and after they went back to rest, Jo-young gathered around the destroyer armor again and began to study it. He also wanted his own set of iron armor. Stark had one, Thor had one, and even later, Captain America Rogers and Spider-Man Peter Parker, among many others, had their own iron armor. Jo-young now also wanted a set. A set of magic armor that completely belonged to him and could fully unleash his strength. The sky was clear and the air was crisp, a rare refreshing day even over the desert. On a hillside not far from the base, a group of people were saying goodbye to each other. Sif and the Warriors 3 were waiting on the other side, while Thor hugged everyone in turn. "Don't worry, Coulson from S.H.I.E.L.D., I will quickly handle the things I promised you after Alaska is settled." Thor patted Coulson's shoulder hard, and Coulson also had a rare look of joyful smiles. Any fool could see that they had definitely reached a series of secret agreements with each other last night. This kind of thing is very common within the countries of Earth, but unexpectedly, the seemingly burly Thor was not unfamiliar with this aspect at all. "I will find a way to get some Uru metal for you, but not too much, Stark, and it will take some time. This matter needs to be discussed with the dwarves of Nidavellir, as they are in charge of these things." Thor looked at Stark with some apology. "No need to rush, getting a little is better than nothing. I'm just using it for research." Stark smiled very calmly. But Jo-young, who heard all of this clearly from the side, had indeed become vigilant in secret. What does Stark want Uru metal for? Is it just for research, or does he have other plans? In the entire Marvel universe, there are 3 known precious metals: vibranium, Uru metal, and Yaka metal. Vibranium is the most well-known metal to Earthlings. Captain America Rogers' Captain America's shield, Wolverine Logan's adamantium skeleton, and Deadpool Wade Wilson's 2 long swords, and even the nanotech armor Stark built later, the most basic metal is vibranium. Uru metal is the metal that must be added when Asgard forges almost all artifacts. Thor's hammer, Odin's eternal spear, and the destroyer armor, as well as many other super weapons, are all made of Uru metal. One aspect where Uru metal is superior to vibranium is its ability to better store and conduct magic power. Yaka metal is the special metal contained in the Yaka arrow used by Star-Lord Peter Quill's adoptive father, Yondu. It can completely obey the power of human voice. What does Stark want Uru metal for? What does he want to forge? This point must be vigilant, because in some ways, Stark is as annoying as Batman. Just as Batman has always liked to create special weapons against various people who can threaten Earth, Stark also has a similar bad habit. Just like Batman has the most famous anti-Superman armor, anti-Flash armor, anti-Aquaman armor, Insider suit, and many other legendary equipments, Stark also has the famous anti-Hulk armor, anti-Magneto armor, anti-Phoenix armor, and there should also be anti-Thor armor, or rather, anti-magic armor. Perhaps Stark is researching Uru metal to prepare against super war weapons like the destroyer armor, and of course, it is also very likely that he is making some preventive preparations against Thor. He and Batman are very similar in some aspects. Jo-young showed many of his abilities in the battle against the destroyer armor this time. I believe that both Stark's Jarvis AI system and SHIELD's Coulson will make detailed combat research reports after returning. It is not impossible for them to take some special precautions against Jo-young in the future. This needs to be careful, because in a certain dimension of the Marvel Universe, the Sentry robots almost wiped out the entire mutant race. If Wolverine Logan hadn't traveled through time to the past and changed time, then the mutant race might have already completely perished. Perhaps even on Logan's original timeline, the mutants might have already been completely wiped out by the Sentry robots. You must be very careful with people like Stark. For the sake of the greater good, they do not hesitate to sacrifice their closest comrades. The Civil War of superheroes reflected this characteristic of Stark to some extent, except that Captain America Rogers was the one who suffered the loss that time. Jo-young watched Thor try to hug Jane Foster, but was directly avoided by Jane Foster. This awkward scene drew his attention back. He could more or less understand Jane Foster's feelings. After all, Jane Foster's boyfriend had always been Donald Blake, not Thor, but now, Donald Blake could no longer return, and Thor was also about to leave. Jo-young didn't know how Jane Foster and Thor would get along in the future, or perhaps they didn't know how to get along with each other either. Perhaps this is the reason why they would eventually completely estrange from each other until death. When he saw Thor, Dr. Shagway, and Daisy Louise saying goodbye and walking towards him, a sincere smile appeared on Jo-young's face. Perhaps Thor might change after becoming the God King of Asgard, but before that, before the end of Ragnarok in Asgard, he is a friend worth making, especially compared to Stark. He doesn't have many malicious intentions. Joe, wait until next time. After we meet again, I will find all the runes I can find for you. Thor said, patting Jo-young's back hard. I really have to thank you for your help this time. Without you, things probably wouldn't have ended so easily. Then you should also be careful this time. I look forward to our next gathering. After speaking, Jo-young took a step back, and Thor also nodded in encouragement, striding towards Sif and the Warriors 3. Thor knew best what Jo-young wanted. If Jo-young wanted to achieve godhood, he had to delve deeper into rune magic. Otherwise, he would be forever suppressed at the legendary realm, or become a special existence like the legendary mage Merlin. Jo-young had no interest in being permanently fixed on Earth, and before he could obtain the divine power granted by Odin, if he wanted to become stronger, he had to achieve greater accomplishments in the field of magic. A powerful magician, even if only in the legendary realm, if he performs well, he can contend with powerful gods. Although he cannot become a god, a powerful magician is definitely an existence that cannot be ignored in the entire universe. Before obtaining the Infinity Stones, this is currently the only path for Jo-young to become strong. In fact, Thor's help this time was already significant. Whether it is the Thunder Rune or the Spatial Rune, it is enough for Jo-young to study for a long time to come. In this regard, he is still very grateful to Thor. After all, the current Thor is still a very easy-going person. He has very upright values and is a very trustworthy companion. Thor walked directly towards the destroyer armor surrounded by Sif and the Warriors 3. The next moment, under the somewhat surprised gazes of the crowd, the armor between the chest and abdomen of the destroyer armor actually slid open layer by layer to both sides, and then directly enveloped Thor within it. The faceplate closed, and two Thor's hammers simultaneously appeared in the hands of the destroyer armor. Immediately after, countless thunderbolts poured directly from the two Thor's hammers into the destroyer armor. A powerful pressure was suddenly generated, and Coulson and other weaker individuals immediately couldn't help but retreat several steps. And it was at this moment, as countless thunderbolts continuously surged on the destroyer armor, circle after circle of magic runes emerged from the body of the destroyer armor, and then quickly fell towards the ground beneath its feet, finally forming a rune magic array that looked extremely familiar. In fact, only Jo-young could clearly see this scene. Perhaps other Asgardians also roughly understood what was happening, but they did not understand the specifics, and they didn't even want to understand. Jo-young's gaze was fixed on the newly formed rune magic array on the ground. At this time, everyone noticed that this rune magic array was very similar to the Summon Rainbow Bridge rune magic array that Thor had previously taught him, but there were significant differences in some key details. In an instant, Jo-young broke out in a cold sweat all over. The Summon Rainbow Bridge rune magic array that Thor had taught him before had a problem. Could it be that Thor knew beforehand that the Summon Rainbow Bridge rune magic array was fundamentally impossible to succeed, or that he knew the rune magic array was wrong, but he still did it, with the purpose of forcing Loki to take action in this situation? No, that's not right. If that rune magic array had a problem, then Loki, who is also proficient in rune magic and is in Asgard, couldn't possibly fail to see the problem. If he truly knew that rune magic array was wrong, then he wouldn't need to send the destroyer armor to Earth at all. He would only need to wait for that rune magic array to start operating, and then the rune magic array's failure would be enough. That way, he might even be able to use the magic element disorder, or even explosion, caused by the rune magic array's failure to directly severely injure Thor. But Loki didn't do that, or to be precise, he couldn't do it. He couldn't detect the problem with that rune magic array at all. That is to say, at least in the eyes of Thor and Loki, that summon Rainbow Bridge rune magic array was correct. As for whether it could actually summon the Rainbow Bridge, that would depend on the final experiment, but it is unknown if Jo-young will have a chance in the future. However, the rune magic array in front of him truly worked, because under the flashing golden light, the magnificent and majestic seven-colored Rainbow Bridge suddenly descended from the infinitely distant depths of the universe with a roar. The blinding light made everyone squint their eyes. The next moment, Thor's loud laughter came from the seven-colored Rainbow Bridge. "Goodbye everyone, we will meet again if fate allows next time." As Thor's words fell, the seven-colored red light suddenly converged, directly carrying Thor and the others down into the endless depths of the universe. And it was at this moment, something was suddenly thrown out from the seven-colored Rainbow Bridge. Jo-young reached out his hand, and although there was some surprise on his face, he still steadily caught the Thor's hammer that was thrown back. And at this time, Thor's voice also sounded from this Thor's hammer. "Daniel, my friend, I said that this Thor's hammer belongs to you, and it will only ever belong to you. You don't have to worry that someone will take it away from you one day. Perhaps you should give it a new name, just like my brother Beta Ray Bill. The name of his Thor's hammer is now called Stormbreaker, and he is also called Horse-Faced Thor." Horse-Faced Thor, Jo-young immediately thought of him. In this universe, it is not just him and Thor who possess Thor's hammer. Before this, there was another very famous figure, and that is Horse-Faced Thor. Horse-Faced Thor's most famous deed is that he, like Hulk, became the strongest gladiator champion in the arena on Sakaar under the Grand Master. Thor is reminding Jo-young that Jo-young can use Thor's hammer without any reservations, just like Horse-Faced Thor. Horse-Faced Thor is a brother recognized by Thor, which means Jo-young has also been recognized by Thor. This means that Thor will not take away the Thor's hammer in Jo-young's hand, and even when Odin takes action, Thor will stop him. Jo-young can use Thor's hammer with confidence and without any reservations. For him, this is equivalent to the entire world being completely different. I hope everyone will support it and subscribe for more videos.